On the morning of February 19, 2026, 6 unmarked police vehicles pulled quietly onto the grounds of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, England. There was no fanfare, no announcement. The vehicles moved through the frost-stiffened winter air and stopped at the house where Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor had been living since being expelled by his own brother, the King, from his home of 23 years. He had just turned 66 years old. It was his birthday. The arrest happened quickly and without ceremony. Thames Valley Police confirmed that a man in his 60s from Norfolk had been taken into custody on suspicion of misconduct in public office. They did not name him. They did not need to. By the time the statement reached newsrooms, journalists across 6 continents already knew exactly who was inside those vehicles. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, formerly Prince Andrew, Duke of York, Knight of the Garter, once second in line to the British throne, son of Queen Elizabeth II, younger brother of the reigning King Charles III. The man who, in a disastrous television interview 7 years earlier, had claimed he could not have sexually abused a 17-year-old girl because he had spent the relevant evening eating pizza in Woking. Emily Maitlis, the journalist who had conducted that interview in 2019, told CNN she was absolutely stunned. She described it as a historic moment unlike anything Britain had seen in centuries. The last time a royal was arrested was in 1647. She said, "That is how significant it is, 1647. The year that would ultimately lead to the beheading of King Charles I and the temporary abolition of the monarchy altogether." Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was not going to be beheaded, but the comparison sat in the air like smoke, and nobody who heard it moved to wave it away. The story of how Andrew reached that unmarked police vehicle on his 66th birthday is long, complicated, and in many ways far more disturbing than the tabloid shorthand has ever managed to capture. It is not simply a story about a prince and a pedophile. The tabloid summaries have always made it sound like a momentary lapse in judgment, a failure of character visible only in retrospect. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. The pattern of Andrew's life, traced from his earliest years in Buckingham Palace through the Falklands and his Playboy years and his decade as trade envoy and his years of denial and legal maneuvering, reveals something that was always there, an absolute, bone-deep belief that the rules of ordinary human conduct did not apply to him, that, whatever he wanted, he was entitled to take. A childhood playmate who knew him at Heatherdown Preparatory School once described him as a tiresome little shit. A former member of the palace staff who worked under the Queen called him a bloody nuisance. A junior naval officer who served alongside him remembered that Andrew was always the prince before he was an officer, that every quality you looked for in a serviceman, the dedication, the duty, the willingness to subordinate yourself to the needs of the team, was always secondary to his image of himself as royalty and what he was owed by it. Nobody who knew Andrew from those early years professed to be shocked by where he ended up. What surprised many of them was that it took as long as it did. If you are watching this channel for the first time, do us a favor before you continue. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. We produce deep investigations like this one regularly, and we never want you to miss one. Now, back to the story. The story begins not in a nightclub in London or on a Caribbean island or in a Manhattan townhouse filled with hidden cameras. It begins in the autumn of 1960, when a baby was born at Buckingham Palace to the most famous woman in the world. She had 2 children already, Charles, 11 years old, who was being groomed from birth for a duty he had not chosen and would spend decades quietly resenting. Anne, 10, already the sharpest of the Queen's children and, by most accounts, the one most willing to tell it straight. Andrew arrived in February of 1960. He was the first child born to a reigning British monarch in over 100 years, and the palace staff remembered how the Queen looked at him, how the reserve that characterized her public self seemed to dissolve in his presence. She was entranced by him. That was the word people used, over and over, entranced, as if this chubby, laughing baby had cast something over her that she never quite shook loose. He was beautiful, and he knew it early. Everyone at the palace responded to him, footmen, ladies in waiting, the officers of the household guard who stood rigid at their posts, all of them softened around Andrew in a way they did not soften around Charles or Anne. A 5-year-old boy with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no, he roamed the corridors of Buckingham Palace as though he owned them, which in a very real sense he presumed that he did. The stories from those early years cluster around a particular kind of behavior. He tied the laces of the palace sentries together. He hid the cutlery when footmen were setting the dining table. He slid down the staircases on an expensive silver tray that he had taken from the kitchen without asking, because the thought of asking had not occurred to him. When he was caught stealing another boy's collection of exotic stamps at Heatherdown, he shrugged it off. Not with the embarrassment of a child caught doing something wrong, but with the boredom of someone to whom the concept of consequences had never been convincingly introduced. His mother watched and adored, and, by most accounts, declined to correct any of it. A former Buckingham Palace employee later described a scene that stayed with them for decades. Andrew was perhaps 5 or 6 years old. He walked up to a middle-aged man who had worked for the Queen for years, a trusted member of the household with a long record of loyal service, and said, "Bring me that horse." Pointing to a toy on the other side of the room, the man fetched it. He did it because there was no alternative. Because the child pointing at him was the Queen's son, and in that house, in that arrangement of power, the child's wish was not a request. It was a demand with a title attached. A third story from those years is darker in its own way. Andrew was 5 years old when he wandered into the stables at Windsor and began tormenting the horses, teasing them, striking their legs with a stick. The grooms and stable hands asked him, politely, to stop. He didn't stop. He got worse. His behavior became, in the account of one person present, so awful that the stable staff lost their patience and threw him onto a dung heap and shoveled horse manure on top of him. He ran back into the house screaming that he would tell his mother. He probably did tell his mother, and if he did, we can be reasonably confident she did not make his life particularly uncomfortable for it. His younger brother Edward arrived in 1964. Charles, Anne, Andrew, Edward, 4 children who would grow up inside one of the most scrutinized households in human history. Charles was cerebral and sensitive and visibly miserable in the role that had been assigned to him. Anne was direct to the point of bluntness and had little patience for the theatre of royalty. Edward was shy and struggled with the expectations placed on him. Andrew was none of these things. Andrew was the golden child, the one who smiled at cameras without needing to be coached, the one who walked into a room and immediately began assessing what it contained that he could claim for himself. Royal biographer Tom Quinn wrote that from the very earliest age, Andrew seems to have imbibed a sense of his own importance that outweighed that of any of his siblings. Part of that, Quinn argued, came from the extra attention he received from his mother. But part of it was simply innate, a quality of character that no amount of parenting could have manufactured, one that sat in Andrew like a stone in his chest from the moment he drew his first breath. The Queen was not a neglectful mother in the conventional sense. She was attentive when she was present. She was curious about her children, interested in them, genuinely fond of them all. But she was also a working head of state with a schedule that demanded more hours than any 24-hour day contained. And the raising of her children was largely deputed to nannies and governors and the rhythms of an institution that had operated the same way for 300 years. Andrew grew up with very little structure that was not formal and very little correction that was not conditional. The message he received, day after day, was that he was special. That he was loved absolutely, that the world would arrange itself around him. He went to Heatherdown Preparatory School in Berkshire at the age of 8. His classmates remembered him as cocky, not very bright, bumptious. The word bumptious carries within it a particular kind of social abrasiveness, loud, self-important, pushing forward where others hang back. Deeply unaware that the volume and confidence are not being perceived the way he imagines. Andrew was bumptious in the way that only a child who has never been told to be quiet could be. He brought the palace's deference with him into every room he entered, and he was genuinely surprised when other children did not respond to him with the same reverence the footman had shown. From Heatherdown he went to Gordonstoun in Scotland, the boarding school that had also educated his father Prince Philip and his older brother Charles. Gordonstoun had a reputation for toughness, for cold mornings and physical endurance and the stripping away of privilege. Charles had hated it, finding the harshness of the environment cruel and the other boys bullying. Andrew navigated it differently. He was not bullied. He was not, by most accounts, especially popular. He was described as a pompous git, a stickler for protocol when it suited him, and a rule breaker when it didn't. He frequently missed the morning roll call. He got away with it, because he was Prince Andrew, and getting away with things was, by 1974 or so, simply what Prince Andrew did. He left Gordonstoun with A-levels in English, history, and economics, which was itself something of a minor surprise given his reputation for academic mediocrity. He was then sent for 6 months to Lakefield College School in Ontario, Canada, where he played rugby and ice hockey, and charmed the local press with a photogenic ease that had been natural to him since infancy. He came back to England in 1979 and joined the Royal Navy. The Navy was supposed to transform him. It is the institution that had transformed his father, and in some quarters there was optimism that the discipline and structure of military service would sand down the sharper edges of Andrew's entitlement. His commanders were cautious. A junior pilot who served alongside Andrew remembered the specific way he announced himself. He went to his new superior officer and said, "I hear you're going to be my superior." The officer confirmed this. Andrew said, "In that case, you can call me H." The officer asked why H. Andrew said it was short for HRH, His Royal Highness. The officer said, "That's fine, H. You can call me sir." It is a small story, but it contains within it the whole of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor compressed into 4 lines of dialogue. He assumed that the military was another palace, with different uniforms but the same underlying arrangement of power. He assumed that his title preceded his rank. He assumed that even in the context of naval hierarchy, where rank was everything and protocol was absolute, his status as a prince entitled him to be addressed with deference by the people supposed to be commanding him. He was wrong, but he was 20 years old and no one had ever told him he was wrong about anything important, and so he walked forward, as he always had, as if the path would clear for him because it always had. It did not always clear in the Navy. Andrew was sent to RNAS Culdrose in Cornwall for helicopter training, and then transferred to 820 Naval Air Squadron. He was by all accounts a competent pilot, perhaps better than competent. One of his commanders from the Falklands period, Nigel Ward, described him in his memoir as an excellent pilot and a very promising officer. Several of his colleagues pushed back on the arrogance narrative, insisting he was a good crew member who flew well and didn't cause trouble. The truth, as it usually is with Andrew, seems to sit somewhere in the difficult middle ground, a man who could perform when the situation demanded it, who could set aside his entitlement in the cockpit when lives depended on it, but who had not, even in the Navy, genuinely absorbed the lesson that other people's needs and time and dignity mattered equally to his own. Then Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. In April of 1982, a task force assembled in Portsmouth Harbour to retake a group of rocky islands 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic. Andrew was 22 years old and serving as a Sea King helicopter co-pilot aboard HMS Invincible, one of only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the British fleet. The British government was deeply uncertain about sending a prince into active combat. Andrew was, at that point, second in the line of succession to the throne. If something happened to him, it would be a national catastrophe. There were cabinet discussions about moving him to a desk role, finding him some safe administrative posting well away from the shooting. Queen Elizabeth refused. Her son wanted to serve, she said. He had trained for this. He would go. The decision was brave, and it was right. And whatever Andrew became in the years that followed, his conduct in the Falklands deserves to be stated clearly and without diminishment. He flew his Sea King on anti-submarine missions. He flew casualty evacuations, retrieving the wounded from beneath enemy fire. And he flew the most dangerous assignment of all, Exocet decoy. The Argentine Air Force was using French-designed Exocet anti-ship missiles to devastating effect, flying them at wave height to evade British radar and into the flanks of Royal Navy vessels. The Sheffield had been sunk that way. The Atlantic Conveyor, a container ship pressed into service as a troop carrier, had been sunk that way. 12 British sailors died in that attack, and Andrew flew above the burning vessel in the immediate aftermath. The decoy missions required Andrew to fly his helicopter in front of British ships, close enough to the water's surface that an incoming missile, seeking the largest radar return, might lock onto him instead of the vessel behind him. There is no polite way to describe this. He was bait. He was 22 years old, flying a helicopter as bait for missiles designed to pierce the hulls of ships, and he did it without being compelled to, and he did it well. And when the war ended and the Argentine forces surrendered in June of 1982, Andrew flew back to Britain as something the palace had not given him. Something you could not manufacture with good lighting and a well-chosen speech. He flew back as a genuine hero. He was photographed stepping off the ship with a single red rose clenched between his teeth, grinning that wide, easy grin. The public loved it. They loved him. He was young and handsome and had risked his life for his country and wore his uniform well, and for a brief warm period in the early 1980s, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor seemed to have become something close to what the palace had always hoped he would be. It did not last. The nickname Randy Andy did not arrive with any particular incident. It accumulated. There was a girlfriend, actress Koo Stark. The relationship splashed across every tabloid front page. There were other women, photographed on holiday in Thailand, cavorting topless on beaches that someone always seemed to be watching from a telephoto lens. There were parties at which he appeared in the company of people the palace wished he would keep his distance from. There were rumors and reports, and the growing, nagging sense that the hero of the Falklands had returned to type, that the discipline of combat had done exactly what the preparatory school and Gordonstoun had failed to do, had produced in him a temporary performance of seriousness that was, at its core, performance. He married in 1986. Sarah Ferguson, flame-haired and extrovert and the daughter of the Queen's polo manager, became the Duchess of York on a July afternoon that drew crowds to the streets of London the way only royal events could. The wedding was watched by 500 million people worldwide. Andrew seemed genuinely happy. Sarah seemed genuinely happy. Their first daughter, Princess Beatrice, arrived in 1988. Princess Eugenie followed in 1990. By 1992, they had separated. The marriage collapsed under the weight of Andrew's constant absences, the relentlessness of his naval career and his travel schedule, and the pressure of a media that treated Sarah with a hostility that many observers found excessive and that she found crushing. In the summer of '92, photographs appeared showing Texan financial advisor John Bryan sucking the toes of the Duchess of York on a French beach while her daughters played nearby. The photographs were taken by a telephoto lens from hundreds of meters away. They appeared on every front page in Britain. Andrew and Sarah separated, and then in 1996 they divorced, though they continued to share royal lodge at Windsor as what they described to the public as a co-parenting arrangement, an explanation that satisfied no one but that the palace elected not to challenge. The Air Miles Andy nickname came later, accumulating during his decade as UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a role he took on after leaving the Navy in 2001. He travelled constantly. He played golf constantly. He charged the taxpayer for helicopters when commercial flights were available, and then charged more for vehicles once he had landed. He met with controversial figures across Central Asia and the Middle East whose wealth was conspicuous and whose relationship to democratic governance was, at best, ornamental. He was photographed with oligarchs and sheikhs and financiers whose names would later appear in court documents that nobody wanted their name appearing in. But none of that, none of the golf and the helicopters and the questionable handshakes became the defining catastrophe of his life. That came through a woman named Ghislaine Maxwell. It came through a man named Jeffrey Epstein. And it came, according to the accounts of the women who were there, to a girl of 17 who was brought to London in the spring of 2001 and handed to a prince who, she would later say, seemed to believe that having sex with her was his birthright. Ghislaine Maxwell was born in 1961, the ninth and youngest child of Robert Maxwell, a Czech-born Jewish media baron who owned the Daily Mirror newspaper, was a former Member of Parliament, and was widely understood within Fleet Street to be one of the most comprehensively dishonest people in British public life. Robert Maxwell had built his fortune through a combination of genuine business acumen, legally dubious financial manipulation, and an almost supernatural ability to bully anyone who tried to examine his accounts too closely. He died in November of 1991, falling from his yacht off the Canary Islands. Whether he fell or jumped or was pushed is a question that has never been conclusively answered. What the fall left behind was a family that discovered, in the weeks following his death, that their father had stolen approximately £450 million from the pension funds of companies he controlled, leaving 27,000 employees facing poverty in their retirements. The Maxwell name, already complicated, curdled almost overnight into something considerably darker. Ghislaine had been her father's favourite daughter. She had grown up in extraordinary wealth, educated at Marlborough College and then at Balliol, Oxford, socialised with the kind of people whose photographs appeared in country life. She had the title in a way without the lineage. She was comfortable with aristocracy because she had grown up adjacent to it, had attended the same schools, had spent summer weekends in the same houses. After her father's death, she moved to New York and, within a year or two, had attached herself to Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was, by all available accounts, one of the strangest men ever to accumulate serious money in Manhattan. He had no verifiable university degree, had taught physics and mathematics at the Dalton School before being let go for reasons that were not publicly explained at the time, and had entered the world of finance through a connection he made with a Dalton parent named Alan Greenberg, who ran Bear Stearns. By the mid-1990s, Epstein was operating as a private wealth manager for a client roster that was never fully disclosed but that appeared to include several billionaires who trusted him with assets too complicated or too sensitive to hand to a conventional firm. He was peculiar in ways that everyone who spent time with him eventually commented on. He didn't drink. He didn't eat in restaurants with other people if he could help it. He moved between properties in a way that resembled less the life of a wealthy man than the schedule of someone managing an operation across multiple locations simultaneously. He had a private island in the United States Virgin Islands, a converted former palm oil factory on Little Street James, which he called Little Street Jeff. He had a 7-story mansion on East 71st Street in Manhattan. He had a ranch in New Mexico. He had a penthouse in Paris. He had a private jet, a Boeing 727 that his staff called the Lolita Express, a name that was apparently not meant ironically. Ghislaine Maxwell became, in the years following her arrival in New York, Epstein's girlfriend, then his ex-girlfriend, then something that had no entirely adequate name, an intimate associate, a business partner in an enterprise whose nature was not fully understood by most people who observed it from the outside. The person who was most often by his side, and who was most responsible for the social engineering that made his operation possible. She recruited young women. She introduced them to Epstein. She managed them, maintained relationships with them, kept them close in a way that one Epstein victim later described as the process of a spider maintaining a web, patient, deliberate, and always in motion. She was also Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Robert Maxwell, educated at Oxford, a social figure in both London and New York, who brought with her a specific kind of legitimacy that Epstein, for all his money, could not entirely manufacture. Her name opened doors. Her presence in a room signaled to other people that they were in a world they knew, among people who were, in the broadest sense, like them. She was the wrapper around something that, examined without the wrapper, would have been unambiguously disturbing from the first. And it was through Ghislaine Maxwell that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor met Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew had known Ghislaine for years before Epstein appeared in the story. They had met in the late 1980s, at the kind of London parties that brought together the children of the wealthy and the connected in rooms where the champagne was French and the furniture was antique. They were not close in any deep sense. But they were in the same world, which in British social terms means they were available to each other, that when either of them needed someone to fill a table or complete a guest list, the other was on the list of people to call. In 1999, Ghislaine introduced Andrew to Jeffrey Epstein. She had been with Epstein for several years by then. She brought them together at a social event whose specific details have been variously described, but whose basic character is clear. It was an occasion in the world that both men inhabited, and Maxwell, who knew both of them, performed the introduction that was her primary social function, the thing she did that made her indispensable to both of them. Photographs from the summer of that year, shown later during Ghislaine Maxwell's trial in 2021, place Andrew, Epstein and Maxwell together at Balmoral, the Queen's beloved Scottish estate where the royal family spent every summer, and which was, in terms of access, one of the most exclusive addresses in the world. The photographs were taken at the main residence, beside what appeared to be a log cabin that had been photographed many times over the decades with the Queen herself sitting beside it. Andrew had invited them both to stay. Whatever his mother knew or did not know about Jeffrey Epstein in 1999, she cannot have been unaware that her son had brought these particular guests into the heart of the family's private life. In February of 2000, flight logs obtained later by the Daily Mirror showed Andrew flying with Ghislaine Maxwell aboard Epstein's private jet to Little Street, James, the island in the United States Virgin Islands that would later acquire the informal designation that no one who watched the news in the late 2000 teens needed to be told. Later that year, in August of 2000, Epstein and Maxwell were present at a party at Windsor Castle celebrating Andrew's 40th birthday, and they were photographed at Royal Ascot that June. The friendship was not hidden. Andrew was not concealing it. He was genuinely proud of it. In February of 2000, there was a party at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach, Florida, the kind of event that, in retrospect, seems to have gathered more future notoriety per square foot than any single party had a right to. A photograph survives from that evening showing Melania Trump, Gwendolyn Beck, Jeffrey Epstein, and Prince Andrew, all four of them smiling for a photographer as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. Donald Trump, in a 2015 interview, when asked about what happened on Epstein's private island, told the reporter to ask Prince Andrew, "That island was really a cesspool." Trump said, "There's no question about it, just ask Prince Andrew, he'll tell you about it." Trump made that statement in 2015. By then, Andrew had been insisting for years that he barely knew Epstein, that they were friendly acquaintances at most, that the friendship had been grossly misrepresented by a press with an agenda. Trump's offhand comment from a courtyard interview passed largely unnoticed at the time. It did not pass unnoticed by everyone. In the summer of 1999, at almost exactly the moment that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were establishing themselves in Andrew's social world, a girl named Virginia Roberts was working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach, Florida. She was 15 years old. She was not, in any meaningful sense, a child who had been protected by the adults around her. Her life before Mar-a-Lago had contained things that no child's life should contain: a father who was largely absent, a stepmother she struggled to connect with, sexual abuse by a family friend that began when she was 7 years old. She had run away from home at 13 and had been sexually exploited by a man who picked her up on the street and took her home under the pretense of helping her. She was at Mar-a-Lago because her father had gotten a job there as a maintenance worker. She had been hired to work in the spa, attending to guests, carrying towels, learning the quiet choreography of a hospitality establishment designed to make the very wealthy feel as though the world had been arranged specifically for their comfort. One afternoon in 1999, while she was carrying towels in the area near the pool, a woman approached her. The woman was expensively dressed, well-spoken, and friendly in the specific way that people trained in social engineering learn to be: attentive, interested, reflecting back to you the best version of yourself. The woman said she had noticed Virginia, that she seemed bright and personable. She said she might know someone who could help Virginia make more of herself, who could offer her opportunities that a girl her age in her situation would not otherwise have access to. The woman was Ghislaine Maxwell. Virginia was recruited that afternoon. She went to work for Jeffrey Epstein as what was described at the time as a masseuse, a cover story so thin that only the complete absence of protective adult scrutiny in her life allowed it to stand. She received massage training at Epstein's expense and began traveling with him and Maxwell to his various properties. She was 16 years old. The sexual abuse began almost immediately. By 2001, Virginia Roberts was 17 years old and had been living inside Epstein's orbit for roughly 2 years. She was not an employee in any conventional sense. She was a human being who had been systematically groomed since she was 15, who had been convinced by her abusers that this was work, that what was happening to her was a form of opportunity, that Epstein and Maxwell were investing in her future. She had learned not to ask questions she didn't want to hear the answers to. She had learned that defiance had costs and compliance had rewards, and that the rewards, though they were the rewards of a gilded cage, were preferable to whatever waited for her outside. In early 2001, Epstein decided she should go to London. She travelled there in March. She was met by Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell took her to a restaurant for dinner, and the other guests at the dinner were Jeffrey Epstein and a man that Maxwell introduced as an old friend. He was heavy-set, with the look of someone who had once been athletic, and who carried the remnants of that athleticism in his bearing without particularly putting himself to the trouble of maintaining it. He was 41 years old. His name, which Maxwell provided without apparent self-consciousness, was Prince Andrew. In her memoir, published posthumously in October of 2025 under the title Nobody's Girl, Virginia Giuffre described what happened that night and in the hours that followed. She wrote that the group went from dinner to a London nightclub called Tramp, where she and the prince danced and drank cocktails. On the way home to Maxwell's townhouse, Maxwell turned to Virginia in the car and said, "When we get home, you are to do for him what you do for Jeffrey." Virginia Giuffre was 17 years old. She had been trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean by a convicted sex offender and his associate. She was being given instructions, in the back of a car, about what was expected of her in the next hour. In the memoir, Giuffre wrote about Andrew with a kind of flat, observational precision that the years between 1999 and the book's publication had sharpened into something close to clinical. She described him as friendly enough. She said he guessed her age correctly, that he said, "My daughters are just a little younger than you," which would have required him to do no mathematics at all, since both Beatrice and Eugenie were in single digits at the time. She wrote that he was entitled, that he seemed to behave as if having sex with her was his birthright. She wrote that he seemed in a rush and that the whole thing lasted less than half an hour. After it was over, Jeffrey Epstein paid her $15,000. She had not wanted to have sex with the prince, she wrote. She had felt that she had to. Their livelihoods depended on keeping Epstein happy. And beyond that, more fundamentally, she genuinely believed there was no way out, that she had passed the point at which leaving was a real option, that the person she had been before she met Ghislaine Maxwell at Mar-a-Lago no longer existed in any form she knew how to access. This was one night. There were two more. The second encounter took place at Jeffrey Epstein's mansion on East 71st Street in Manhattan when Virginia was still 17. She described an orgy in the memoir, a gathering that included approximately 8 other girls who appeared to be under 18 and who did not speak much English. The third encounter she described took place on Epstein's private island, Little Street James, the following year when Virginia was 18. Prince Andrew has denied every element of every one of these accounts for more than 20 years. He has said he has no recollection of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre. He has said the photograph of him with his arm around her waist may have been doctored. He has said, in what became possibly the most mocked alibi in the history of British public life, that he could not have been with Giuffre at Tramp nightclub on the night in question because he had been at Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter Beatrice. He has offered, at various points, a range of other explanations and denials and framings that have each collapsed under scrutiny and been replaced by new ones. He has never answered a formal question under oath. To understand how a photograph can function as a kind of black hole, pulling events across a decade toward its center, you have to first understand the specific gravitational weight of the image itself. There is a photograph. You have almost certainly seen it. It shows 3 people standing together in what appears to be a domestic interior, a living room or a study in Ghislaine Maxwell's London townhouse. On the left, a teenage girl with dark hair pulled back, wearing a pink short-sleeved top and shiny low-rise jeans. In the center, a large man in his early 40s with his arm around the teenage girl's waist, pulling her body toward his, smiling at the camera with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being photographed. On the right, Ghislaine Maxwell wearing a turtleneck, smiling in the relaxed way of someone watching 2 people she has brought together. The teenage girl is Virginia Roberts. The large man is Prince Andrew. The date is approximately March of 2001. She was 17, he was 41. Virginia had a copy of the photograph in her possession. She had taken it as one small piece of evidence in a situation where evidence was the only protection she had. It stayed with her through the years that followed, through her eventual escape from Epstein's network, through her marriage and her children and her move to Australia, through the lawsuit against Epstein and the lawsuit against Maxwell, and ultimately the lawsuit against Andrew himself. In 2011, Virginia spoke to a journalist from the Mail on Sunday, a British tabloid. She showed the journalist the photograph. A photographer named Michael Thomas was present and photographed the photograph, creating a copy from the print Virginia held. Virginia later became the central figure in a Florida court filing by attorneys Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell, who alleged in December of 2014 that Andrew was one of several prominent individuals to have engaged in sexual activity with a minor trafficked by Epstein. The palace denied everything. Andrew denied everything. Spokespeople released statements. Legal letters were sent. The word of a woman who had been trafficked as a teenager was weighed against the word of a prince, and in the beginning, the institution and the title and the history of the family behind him were heavier. But the photograph existed. It is worth pausing here to trace what was happening on Andrew's side of the friendship during the years between Virginia's encounters with him and the moment the photograph reached the public. Because the relationship between Andrew and Epstein did not end in 2001 when the alleged abuse occurred. It continued for years, and it continued in a way that was visible, documented, and ultimately indefensible regardless of what one believed about what happened in that London townhouse. In 2003, Virginia Giuffre alleged she was trafficked to Epstein's Island once more, this time when she was 18. In 2004, Epstein was under investigation by the FBI in Florida, an investigation that had been opened following reports from multiple young women about sexual abuse. By 2005, Palm Beach police were conducting their own investigation. In 2006, federal prosecutors in Florida had assembled a substantial case against Epstein for sex trafficking. Andrew knew none of this is not credible. He was one of Epstein's closest high-profile associates. He had stayed at Epstein's properties across multiple continents. He had traveled on Epstein's private jet. He had attended social gatherings alongside Epstein's known associates, some of whom were already being investigated. In August of 2006, Princess Beatrice turned 18, and her birthday party at Windsor Castle was attended by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Federal investigators were actively examining Epstein's conduct at the time. Andrew arranged for his daughter's 18th birthday party to include a man who was, at that moment, the subject of a federal sex trafficking investigation, and Maxwell, who was Epstein's operational partner in that investigation's subject matter. Sarah Kellen attended the party. She was Epstein's personal assistant, the woman described in court documents as one of his co-conspirators, the person who, victims later testified, managed the logistics of their abuse, scheduling, travel arrangements, the management of the girls' access to Epstein and his properties. Kellen later testified before the U.S. House Oversight Committee that she dined in Andrew's private apartment at Buckingham Palace and went to Princess Beatrice's party at Windsor Castle. Kellen said she did not witness Andrew behave inappropriately and did not identify him as one of the men who abused her. But she placed herself, explicitly and under oath, inside Andrew's domestic world, inside his royal residences, at events centered on his family. The question of whether Andrew knew what Epstein was is, by 2006, not a question about intelligence or observation. He had been described in British tabloids as a man whose relationship with a sex offender raised serious concerns. He had been photographed with Epstein at various social gatherings across multiple years. Epstein had by then been investigated by multiple law enforcement agencies. Andrew invited him to his daughter's 18th birthday party. In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 Florida state charges, soliciting prostitution and soliciting prostitution with a person under the age of 18. He was sentenced to 18 months in a West Palm Beach jail, with a work release arrangement that allowed him to leave the facility for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The arrangement was extraordinarily lenient. negotiated through a federal non-prosecution agreement that the victims who filed claims against him later described as a deliberate betrayal. Epstein registered as a sex offender. Many of the powerful people who had been Epstein's frequent associates quietly disappeared from his orbit at this point. They had the sense, or the counsel, to understand that the proximity was now a liability. Andrew was not among them. In the weeks immediately following Epstein's release from prison in July of 2009, Epstein's files show that documents recording a flight booking were prepared. The passengers were Sarah Ferguson, Princess Beatrice, and Princess Eugenie. The purpose was a visit to Florida. Epstein paid approximately $15,000 for the travel arrangements. The family of the man who had just been released from prison following a conviction for soliciting sex from a girl who was a minor flew to Palm Beach to see him. They were greeted at his estate, where the menu, according to the files, included vegetable lasagna prepared by a Parisian chef. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor later claimed, in his BBC interview, that he had visited Epstein in December of 2010 for a very specific and morally admirable purpose. He said he had flown to New York to tell Epstein, face-to-face, that their friendship was over. He said the two men took a walk together through Central Park. He said that during this walk, he explained to Epstein that, given Epstein's conviction, it was inappropriate for them to continue being seen together. He said that by mutual agreement during that walk, they decided to part company. He left the following day, he said. He claimed he had no contact with Epstein from that day forward. The images of that December visit spread across British tabloids almost immediately. A front page in the News of the World ran a photograph of the two men walking together through Central Park, side by side, 8 months after Epstein's release from prison, with the headline, "Prince, Andy, and the Pedo." The story asked what the fourth in line to the throne was doing meeting a convicted child sex offender, even if he was a billionaire. Andrew's stated explanation for the visit, that he had gone to end the friendship in person rather than by telephone or letter, was received with almost universal skepticism. The criticism was direct. Going to New York to end a friendship is not a thing that people of any background or degree of wealth routinely do. It is a thing that someone explains to a journalist who has caught them in a compromising photograph, a retroactive frame of moral clarity placed over an event that did not, at the time, have any such clarity attached to it. The claim was false in another way, too, one that took years to surface. On February 27th of 2011, 2 months after the supposed Central Park goodbye, the Mail on Sunday published the photograph of Andrew with his arm around the waist of a 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre, with Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background. The following day, on February 28th, a man who had told a BBC interviewer that he had no contact with Epstein from that day forward sent Jeffrey Epstein an email. The email was obtained years later, revealed by The Sun on Sunday and The Mail on Sunday in October of 2025. Andrew had written, "I'm just as concerned for you, don't worry about me. It would seem we are in this together and we'll have to rise above it. Otherwise keep in close touch and we'll play some more soon." He signed it, A.H.R.H. the Duke of York, K.G. "We are in this together," he wrote. The morning after the photograph of him with his arm around a teenage sex trafficking victim was splashed across British front pages, Andrew's first impulse was not to call a lawyer or distance himself from the man whose criminal activity had placed him in the photograph. His first impulse was to write to Epstein and reassure him. To say, "Don't worry about me, we'll get through this, we'll play some more soon." The exclamation marks are worth noting, 4 of them, in a row, following the words suggesting they would continue their relationship. This was not the language of someone who had already ended a friendship at Central Park 2 months earlier. This was the language of someone who was still, very much, in the middle of one. When Emily Maitlis saw that email in October of 2025, she told The Observer that she watched the interview again for the first time in 6 years. The email that emerged last week categorically showed that what he said about his last contact being December 2010 was untrue. She said, "I have become more alive to all the inconsistencies. I think we know now that he lied to me about his contact with Epstein." The trade envoy role was formally terminated in July of 2011. The British government, which had watched Andrew's association with Epstein generate increasingly damaging press for years, finally decided the association was incompatible with his official capacity as the country's representative on international trade missions. He left the role without a public announcement designed to draw attention to why he was leaving. The emails show that Andrew continued corresponding with Epstein even after he left the role. A 2013 email from Epstein to a member of Andrew's household staff, David Stern, reads, "I have a very beautiful friend coming to London on Tuesday. Andrew might want to have her for dinner." A 2014 email, apparently from Stern, included a photograph of him with Andrew and the former Duchess of York with the message, "PA sends his birthday wishes and love." The message also included, without apparent irony, a photograph of champagne being poured down a naked woman. "Champagne for you, even though you don't drink," it said. The palace has never offered a coherent explanation for the continued contact between members of Andrew's household staff and Epstein after the December 2010 Central Park meeting that was supposed to have ended everything. In 2015, Virginia Giuffre, operating in coordination with attorneys David Boies and Paul Cassell, filed a civil lawsuit in Florida naming Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. It was in a filing related to that litigation that Andrew was first named publicly as someone alleged to have had sexual contact with Giuffre when she was a minor. Andrew denied it. In 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after returning from a trip to Paris. He was charged with federal sex trafficking offenses. The charges described a network of underage girls, some as young as 14, recruited and abused at his properties in New York and Palm Beach over a period of years. Within 2 months of his arrest, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Federal investigators ruled his death a suicide. His death removed him from the possibility of trial, from the possibility of cross-examination, and from the possibility of naming the people with whom he had shared those years and those properties and those girls. The British press, which had been circling Andrew's friendship with Epstein for years, began asking more pointed questions. Who had introduced them? Who had known? What did Andrew know about the network? What was he doing on that island? The palace's media team began fielding calls with an urgency that suggested they were watching the horizon for something they had long known was coming. Emily Maitlis was at BBC Newsnight. She had been pursuing an interview with Andrew for a long time. The prince, or more precisely the people managing Andrew's public image, decided that a formal television interview was the way to address the growing pressure. He would sit down with the BBC. He would answer questions. He would be candid and composed. He would explain himself. Buckingham Palace agreed to the interview. Someone made this decision. Someone in the palace hierarchy, possibly with Andrew's enthusiastic support, agreed that the man who had spent decades demonstrating a breathtaking inability to accurately assess how he was being perceived by people outside his immediate circle should be placed in front of a camera and allowed to talk freely for 40 minutes about the most damaging scandal in the history of the British monarchy since Edward VIII abdicated the throne for an American divorcee. The interview was recorded in Andrew's private apartments at Buckingham Palace on November 14, 2019. It was broadcast on November 16. What happened in those 40 minutes has been studied, dissected, dramatized, and taught in media training courses as a monument to the dangers of confusing an inability to perceive your own blind spots with an absence of blind spots. Emily Maitlis was not trying to ambush him. This is worth stating clearly, because part of the mythology that formed around the Newsnight interview was the idea that Maitlis had somehow trapped Andrew, that she had lured him into a room and conducted an aggressive interrogation designed to destroy him. She had not. She arrived with a researcher and a producer and the questions that any competent journalist would ask a man in Andrew's position about the friendship with Epstein, about the allegations made by Virginia Giuffre, about what he knew and when he knew it, and why he maintained the relationship long after Epstein's criminal history became public. The questions were not hostile. They were the questions. What destroyed Andrew in that room was Andrew. He began by explaining his friendship with Epstein in terms that suggested he had not thought particularly hard about how they would sound to a normal person listening in. He had known Epstein, he said, for perhaps 20 years. He saw him once or twice a year. He had stayed at Epstein's properties across the world because Epstein had offered them to him, and it was convenient. He used the word convenient 4 times in the first section of the interview. He described Epstein's ability to introduce him to interesting and influential people, noting that the connections Epstein provided had been actually very useful. He did not, at any point in the early stages of the interview, appear to register the possibility that describing a convicted sex offender as actually very useful might land badly. Maitlis asked about his decision to visit Epstein in New York in December of 2010, months after Epstein's release from prison following his conviction for soliciting sex from a minor. Andrew explained his walk-in-the-park story. He said he had gone to end the friendship in person because it was the honorable and right thing to do. He said it was a straightforward and honorable thing. And the word honorable landed in the interview like a stone in still water, rippling outward in ways he did not see coming. Maitlis noted that many people found it difficult to understand why anyone would fly to New York to end a friendship rather than simply picking up the phone. Andrew said that he had to do it personally, face to face. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why this explanation was not satisfying. Then came the Pizza Express question. Virginia Giuffre had alleged that on the specific night in March of 2001 that she described as the first time Andrew abused her, she and the prince had gone to Tramp nightclub, where she and he danced and drank cocktails. Andrew said he had no recollection of being at Tramp that night. He went further. He said he was very confident that he could account for his whereabouts that evening. He had been, he said, at a Pizza Express in Woking, attending a children's birthday party with his daughter Princess Beatrice. Woking, he said Woking. The Pizza Express alibi was not immediately verifiable. There was no record, no receipt, no photographic evidence. Andrew offered it with the confidence of someone who believed it would be accepted, which told you something about the world he had lived in for 60 years. A world in which statements made by princes were received as authoritative, and where the practical question of evidence was a thing that happened to other people. He said he remembered the Woking trip specifically because going to a Pizza Express in Woking was an unusual thing for him to do. He meant this as a proof. He said, "I remember it because it was unusual, but the logic runs in the opposite direction. The more unusual something is, the more detail it tends to leave in memory." Andrew had no detail to offer. He had a location, a restaurant chain, and a daughter. He could not say what time they had arrived, what they had ordered, who else had been there, how he had travelled there, or what had happened after they left. Maitlis asked about the photograph, the one showing him with his arm around the teenage Virginia Giuffre. Andrew said he had no recollection of the photograph being taken. He said he was not certain the photograph was real. He suggested, with the careful phrasing of someone who had rehearsed this particular moment, that there was a possibility the photograph might not be authentic. In 2026, an email from 2011 would surface, confirming that Andrew had written to Epstein about the photograph the day after it was published. The email confirmed that he was aware of it, engaged with it, and treating it as a shared problem between himself and Epstein. His claim to Maitlis that he had no recollection of the photograph being taken was not a claim about photography. It was a claim that he was making in an interview, on camera, about his own memory, while sitting in a room that cost the British taxpayer a substantial amount to heat and furnish. Whether it was true is a question only Andrew can answer. What is demonstrably true is that he had written to Epstein about that photograph the morning after it appeared, signing the email with his royal title, while claiming on camera years later to have no recollection of it. Perhaps the most extraordinary moment in the interview came when Maitlis asked Andrew about sweating. Virginia Giuffre had said, in her account of the night at Tramp, that Andrew had been sweating heavily, that she had noticed it. Andrew, looking directly at the camera, said that this proved she was wrong. He said that as a result of an injury he had sustained during the Falklands War, he had a medical condition that meant he did not sweat. He could not sweat profusely, he said, because he had a peculiar medical condition, which he described as an adrenaline overdose that had left him incapable of perspiring. He said this with the gravity of someone presenting irrefutable clinical evidence. He said it, again, on camera. Physicians and physiologists interviewed afterward expressed skepticism about the medical explanation. People who knew Andrew from his Navy days expressed skepticism about the Falklands injury story. His former colleagues from the period noted that they had no memory of him sustaining an injury that would have generated this condition, and no one had ever heard him mention it in the decades since the war. The condition he described, in which combat-related adrenaline exposure permanently eliminates the sweating response, does not appear in any medical literature that journalists examining the claim could locate. Meitless asked Andrew whether he regretted his friendship with Epstein. He said, "Still not." 2 words, "still not." He meant to say, "No, I still do not regret it." But the editing of the sentence, the compression of the denial into those 2 words captured something that the longer statement would have buried. Still not. As if regret were a position he had been repeatedly offered and repeatedly declined. As if the regret had come to him in multiple forms and he had sent it back each time. Still not. He went on to explain that the people he had met through Epstein, and the opportunities he had been given to learn, either by Epstein or because of Epstein, had been actually very useful. The phrase sat in the room after he said it and was not taken back. Actually very useful. He was describing a convicted pedophile who had trafficked dozens of girls, some as young as 14, as a useful professional contact. The interview aired on November 16th. The public reaction was immediate and almost completely uniform. Commentators across the political spectrum, royal correspondents, legal analysts, media critics, members of the general public, and an overwhelming majority of social media users concluded that the interview had been a catastrophe, not because Meitless had asked aggressive questions, but because Andrew had answered them. He had sat in that room with the candor of someone who did not understand what he was saying, who had so thoroughly convinced himself of his own version of events that the distance between his version and what any reasonable observer could verify had become invisible to him. He was, in the phrase that quickly attached itself to the interview, a man who could not see himself. He had spent 60 years in rooms where his rank guaranteed him deference, where his view of any situation was accepted as authoritative, where the challenge of having your account of events tested against external reality was something that happened to civilians. He did not know how to do this interview because the entire interview was premised on the idea that he was accountable to the people watching it, and that idea was, to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, a genuinely foreign concept. Within days, Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew would step back from public duties for the foreseeable future. The statement was phrased in the delicate language that palace communications favor, full of phrases that meant one thing literally and something quite different practically. Andrew was stepping back of his own volition, the palace suggested. He had made a decision. He was acting out of concern for the institution. Several of his patronages began distancing themselves within hours of the interview airing. Charities, military organizations, universities, the institutions that had been proud to have a working royal on their letterheads began calculating whether the association was now an asset or a liability, and they arrived, almost uniformly, at the same answer. Within 48 hours, dozens of organizations had announced they were cutting ties with the Duke of York. He had done the interview to clear his name. He had achieved the opposite. His name was, after November of 2019, synonymous with the word Epstein in a way it had never quite been before. Because the interview had confirmed for anyone who had been uncertain that Andrew's explanation of the friendship was not credible, that his denial of any wrongdoing was built on accounts that did not withstand examination, and that his instinct, even under questioning, was to double down rather than acknowledge. Still not. Virginia Giuffre watched the interview in Australia, where she had lived for years with her husband and 3 children. She had spent more than a decade being called a liar by Andrew's legal team, by palace spokespeople, by elements of the British press that found it more comfortable to doubt the account of a trafficked American girl than to accept the implications of what she was saying about a member of the royal family. She had had her credibility attacked in ways that she described, in interviews conducted over those years, as more painful than almost anything else that had happened to her, because she had eventually escaped Epstein and Maxwell. But the campaign against her credibility was something she had to live with every day. The interview was followed, in January of 2022, by Queen Elizabeth stripping Andrew of all his military titles and patronages, a decision that was formally connected to the progress of Giuffre's civil lawsuit in the United States. Judge Lewis Kaplan of the Southern District of New York had rejected Andrew's motion to dismiss the case on the grounds of a prior settlement Giuffre had reached with Epstein in 2009. The prior settlement had contained a clause that Andrew's lawyers argued precluded her from suing him. Judge Kaplan disagreed. Andrew faced a civil trial. He had money but not enough money to fight a Manhattan court case of this scale indefinitely. In February of 2022, the case settled. The settlement has never been fully disclosed. Andrew's legal team filed a document with the court confirming that the parties had reached an agreement and that Andrew intended to make a substantial donation to Virginia Giuffre's charity in support of victims' rights. The document stated that he had never intended to malign her character and that he accepted she had suffered both as an established victim of abuse and as a result of unfair public attacks. He did not admit wrongdoing, he did not apologize, he did not say that what she had described had happened. The amount of the settlement has been reported in various outlets as between £10 and £12 million. Andrew has never confirmed a figure. Virginia Giuffre's attorney, David Boies, confirmed publicly that payment had been received when a New York federal judge dismissed the case with prejudice in March of 2022, meaning she could not refile the claim in the same court. For Virginia Giuffre, the settlement was not justice. She said so publicly, and she said so in the memoir she wrote in the years that followed. She had wanted her day in court. She had wanted to sit across a room from the man she alleged had abused her when she was 17 and look him in the eye while he answered questions under oath. She had wanted a record, official and unambiguous, of what she said had happened. The settlement gave her money and silence where she had wanted truth and accountability. She wrote, in Nobody's Girl, that they would never get a confession. That is what settlements are designed to avoid. She added that after years of his team casting doubt on her credibility, after the attempted smear campaign, after what she described as efforts to hire internet trolls to harass her, the Duke of York owed her a meaningful apology as well. She never got one. Virginia Roberts Giuffre died by suicide near her home in Western Australia on April 25, 2025. She was 41 years old. She had lived long enough to see Jeffrey Epstein arrested but not tried. She had lived long enough to see Ghislaine Maxwell convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. She had lived long enough to reach a civil settlement with the man she alleged had abused her. She had not lived long enough to see him face any criminal charge or give a single answer under oath or look at her face in a courtroom and be required to speak. Her memoir was published 6 months after her death. We are going to stay with this story because it does not end here. If you have been watching this and want to make sure you see what happens next, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell right now. We cover stories like this one as they develop, and there is a great deal more still to come in this case. Now, back to the story. Nobody's Girl was published on October 21, 2025, by Alfred A. Knopf, a division of Penguin Random House. Virginia Giuffre had written the book with co-author Amy Wallace over the years she had been alive. She had expressed an unequivocal wish for it to be published regardless of her circumstances. Her family honored that wish. The book opened with a line that functioned less as a declaration than as a summary of the whole of her life up to the point she met Jeffrey Epstein at 15. I know about monsters, she wrote. As a child, I suffered nearly every kind of abuse: incest, parental neglect, severe corporal punishment, molestation, rape. In her years with Epstein and Maxwell, she wrote, they lent her out to scores of wealthy, powerful people. She was habitually used and humiliated. On some occasions, she was choked, beaten, and bloodied. She believed at times that she might die a sex slave. The book's account of Prince Andrew was specific and unsparing. She described the first evening in detail, the dinner, the nightclub, the instruction from Maxwell in the car, what followed when they returned to Maxwell's townhouse. She wrote that Andrew knew her age. She wrote that he said, my daughters are just a little younger than you. She described him as friendly enough, but entitled, as if having sex with her was his birthright. She described the encounter lasting less than half an hour. She described being paid $15,000 by Epstein afterward, and feeling that the money did not compensate for what had been done to her, that there was no number that could have. She described the second encounter in Manhattan, the gathering that included other girls who appeared to be under 18 who did not speak much English, who had been assembled in that house for purposes that Virginia understood even then with a clarity that made it worse, not better. She described the third encounter on the island. She wrote about what happened after she came forward publicly. She described Andrew hiding behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. She described his legal team's efforts to discredit her, the attempts to hire internet trolls to harass her online, the systematic campaign to characterize her as a fantasist, an opportunist, someone whose account could not be trusted. She wrote that after the 2022 settlement, which came without admission or apology, she had felt something she had difficulty naming. It was not relief, it was not satisfaction. It was a knowledge that money had been paid, that the system had processed her claim, and that the man at the center of it had continued to live his life in a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate, and had never, not once, been required to sit in a public room and be held accountable for any of it. The book was released the week after Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew would give up his use of all remaining royal titles. The timing was not accidental. The palace had been watching the pre-publication coverage of the memoir and had concluded that if Andrew continued using the title Duke of York, the contrast between his stated position, a royal figure serving the crown, and his circumstances, a man whose accuser had just described him in a published book as having abused her at 17, would become politically untenable. Andrew released a statement saying, "In discussion with the King and my immediate and wider family, we have concluded the continued accusations about me distract from the work of His Majesty and the royal family. He was acting out of duty to the institution. He was doing what was right. He was not accepting any of the allegations against him." 9 days later, on October 30th, Buckingham Palace went further. King Charles stripped his brother of every remaining title and honor. Andrew was formally known, from that point, as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. No style, no honorific, no prince. Just a name and a surname and a history that was going to follow him into whatever came next. His lease on Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate that he had occupied since 2003, was formally surrendered. He was given until early 2026 to leave. His eventual destination was Marsh Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, a significantly smaller property that was being renovated at King Charles's private expense. The family of Virginia Giuffre released a statement that day saying, "Today, she declares a victory. She brought down a British prince with her truth and extraordinary courage." A woman who had died 6 months earlier had just, through a book she wrote before she died, achieved the outcome that a civil lawsuit and a decade of public advocacy had never managed to produce. She was not there to see it, she was gone. But the palace had blinked, and the title was gone, and the house was gone, and the word prince was gone, and whatever she had thought victory would feel like. This was the closest the machinery of institutions and privilege had come to acknowledging, in a public and formal way, that something had gone very wrong. In January of 2026, the United States Department of Justice released a tranche of documents from Jeffrey Epstein's estate. The release came after years of legal maneuvering, public pressure, and court orders that had progressively pried the files loose from the grip of institutions and individuals who had reasons to prefer them sealed. The release was massive. Millions of documents, emails, schedules, internal records, correspondence between Epstein and his associates, records of travel and payment and access. The Epstein files, as they became known, contained a great deal that was already known. The names of powerful men who had traveled on his jet, stayed at his properties, attended his parties, flight logs, photographs, hotel records. But they also contained a section that focused attention back on Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor in a way that was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. The new material showed something that had not previously been established with documentary evidence. It showed Andrew, in his capacity as UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, forwarding confidential government documents to Jeffrey Epstein. The emails were specific. In November of 2010, Andrew forwarded to Epstein a report from his special advisor, Amit Patel, about his official visit to Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Vietnam. The report included details of investment opportunities, the kind of commercially sensitive information that is generated by official trade missions and that is supposed to remain within government channels. The email from Epstein's files was sent from an address labeled The Duke and contained the report from Patel along with a message from Andrew that forwarded the document to Epstein. A separate series of emails showed Andrew sharing similar material from other trade missions in 2010 and 2011. One document was described in the files as a confidential brief. The implications were stark. Andrew had been serving as a government trade representative. He had access to information generated through official capacity on behalf of the British state, intended to advance British commercial interests. He had forwarded that information to a man who was, by that point, a registered sex offender and a person whose entire financial operation rested on his ability to position himself at the intersection of power and money. If Epstein received confidential reports about investment opportunities in Asian markets from the UK's official trade representative, he was receiving something with real commercial value. The kind of information that could shape trading decisions, that could give a financial operator advance knowledge of where government attention was being directed. Andrew's stated explanation was that he had simply kept Epstein informed about his work in the way he kept various friends informed about what he was up to. He framed it as casual correspondence, nothing more substantive than telling an old friend where you had been and what you had been doing. The anti-monarchy organization Republic called for a formal investigation into the conduct. They specifically cited the document releases and argued that the forwarding of government material to a registered sex offender who was under investigation by multiple federal agencies constituted misconduct in public office. Thames Valley Police confirmed that they had received the complaint and were assessing it. On February 12, 2026, 1 week before Andrew's 66th birthday, Thames Valley Police confirmed they had opened a formal investigation into allegations of misconduct in public office against Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. A second woman, whose identity was not publicly disclosed, had also come forward to a lawyer named Brad Edwards, the same attorney who had represented Virginia Giuffre. This woman alleged that she had been trafficked to the United Kingdom by Jeffrey Epstein in 2010 when she was in her 20s and had had a sexual encounter with Andrew at Royal Lodge, his Windsor home. She alleged that afterward, Andrew had given her a tour of Buckingham Palace. The lawyer told the BBC on January 31st of 2026, "We're talking about at least one woman who was sent by Jeffrey Epstein over to Prince Andrew. And she even had, after a night with Prince Andrew, a tour of Buckingham Palace." This was, if accurate, a deeply troubling development. The allegations about Virginia Giuffre in 2001 had concerned events that occurred at a private individual's townhouse, at a Manhattan mansion, and on a Caribbean island. These were, legally and institutionally speaking, private spaces. The new allegation placed a woman allegedly trafficked by Epstein inside a royal residence, inside Buckingham Palace. Inside the building where Andrew had been given his private apartments by the monarch, where the British state housed one of its most senior working members, where the Queen's Guard stood at the gate, and where tourists gathered every morning to watch the changing of the honour. He had allegedly brought a woman sent to him by Jeffrey Epstein inside Buckingham Palace and shown her around. Sarah Kellen's congressional testimony, delivered to the U.S. House Oversight Committee on May 21 of 2025, was released in a transcript in June of 2026. Kellen, who had worked for Epstein as his personal assistant for more than a decade beginning in 2001, described, for the first time in a public official setting, what she had personally witnessed about the relationship between Epstein's network and the British royal family. She described dining in Andrew's private apartment at Buckingham Palace. She said, "Prince Andrew was at the New York house. We also went to Andrew's private apartment at Buckingham Palace for dinner. And we were at Princess Beatrice's party at Windsor Castle." She said she had not witnessed Andrew behave inappropriately toward anyone and did not identify him as one of the men who abused her. She also said that she herself had been sexually and psychologically abused by Epstein for more than a decade. Kellen's testimony placed Epstein's operational world, his actual network, the people who enabled and managed what federal prosecutors later described as a vast enterprise of sex trafficking, inside Andrew's private apartments at Buckingham Palace. She was not simply a guest at a party where Epstein happened to be present. She was, by her own account and the account of federal investigators, a co-conspirator in the trafficking operation itself. She had managed logistics for the abuse. She had been protected from prosecution by the non-prosecution agreement that gave Epstein his sweetheart deal in 2008, a deal that was later found by a federal judge to have violated the rights of Epstein's victims. Andrew had invited her to Buckingham Palace for dinner. The UK government, meanwhile, had released a tranche of its own Epstein-related files in May of 2026. These were documents generated through Andrew's trade envoy role and related to the government's understanding of Andrew's relationship with Epstein. The files confirmed the broad picture that had emerged from the US document releases, that Andrew had maintained contact with Epstein beyond the date he claimed the friendship ended, that government officials around him had been aware of the friendship and had continued to operate in proximity to it, and that the trade mission documents forwarded to Epstein were genuine. Trade Minister Chris Bryant, whose department oversaw the UK file release, confirmed that the documents had been redacted only to remove personal information and material whose release would have prejudiced international relations. The files on Andrew confirmed the pattern of government-level information sharing with Epstein that the US files had suggested. Alongside the Andrew files, Peter Mandelson, the former senior Labour politician who had served as UK ambassador to the United States, was also arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. Mandelson had his own Epstein connection, having been photographed at Epstein's Caribbean island and named in the US files. His arrest, coming within weeks of Andrew's and relating to similar allegations about the misuse of his official position in connection with Epstein, widened the scope of what was beginning to look less like an individual failure and more like a systemic one. A pattern in which the proximity of high-level British figures to a convicted sex trafficker had been managed through silence and institutional protection rather than accountability. The scale of the Epstein operation was, in retrospect, impossible to understand without acknowledging how many powerful people had known, or must have known, what it was. Epstein had not run a hidden enterprise. He had run one that was visible, in plain sight, attended by the kind of people whose presence would have been noticed and noted and in some cases photographed. The private island, the Manhattan mansion, the private jet with its flight logs and its passenger manifests. The girls who were present at these locations in numbers that were not consistent with any explanation other than the one the victims themselves had been providing for years. None of this was, by the late 2010s, the subject of genuine uncertainty. What was uncertain was accountability. What was uncertain was whether the institutions that had been closest to Epstein, the institutions that had benefited from his wealth and his connections and his access, would face any meaningful consequence for what they had ignored or enabled, or simply declined to examine. Andrew was the most visible of those institutions. He was not the only one. On the morning of February 19, 2026, 6 unmarked vehicles arrived at the Sandringham estate. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor had been living at a temporary address on the estate, a smaller property made available while Marsh Farm, his designated new home, underwent renovation. He had left Royal Lodge the previous month after, in the words of the palace, dragging his feet about the relocation since the eviction notice had been served the previous October. It was his 66th birthday. The police who arrested him were from Thames Valley Police. The charge was suspicion of misconduct in public office, a common law offence in England and Wales that covers serious willful abuse or neglect of the power or responsibilities of a public office. The Crown Prosecution Service guidance on the offence describes it as requiring that the defendant must have willfully neglected to perform their duty or have willfully misconducted themselves in relation to the duties of that office, and that the misconduct must be serious rather than minor. The maximum sentence under the offence is life imprisonment. The last senior British royal to be arrested was in 1647. That was King Charles I, who was subsequently tried for high treason, convicted, and beheaded outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The comparison was not lost on anyone who reported on Andrew's arrest. The comparison was not meant to suggest that Andrew was likely to be beheaded. The comparison was meant to convey the sheer historical abnormality of what was happening, that a serving king's immediate family member, the brother of the reigning monarch, was being placed in the back of an unmarked police vehicle on suspicion of having used his official government role to benefit a convicted child sex trafficker. King Charles released a statement the day of the arrest. He expressed his deepest concern about the case and stated that the law must take its course. The royal family, he said, gave the authorities their full and wholehearted support and cooperation. He did not name his brother. He was careful not to prejudge the outcome. But the statement was notable for what it did not contain: any expression of personal support for Andrew, any restatement of belief in his brother's innocence, any suggestion that the family stood behind him as they had in the years when the palace had chosen protection over accountability. King Charles had reached the end of something. That much was clear from the statement. The calculation that had defined his approach to Andrew for years, the weighing of institutional reputation against personal loyalty against the legal risks of either position, had arrived at a place where the calculation was no longer primarily his to make. The police had made it for him. Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, submitted a memorandum to the relevant police forces on the day of the arrest regarding the Epstein files, a gesture that indicated the political dimension of the investigation was being taken seriously at the highest levels. The search warrants executed that morning had been served not only at the Sandringham property where Andrew was staying, but also at Royal Lodge, the Windsor mansion he had recently vacated. Police were looking for documents, communications, records of correspondence between Andrew and Epstein during the period of his trade envoy role. Andrew was held for questioning throughout the day. He was released in the evening, under investigation, while the inquiry continued. He was not charged that day. The arrest represented a formal step in the investigative process rather than a conclusion of it, but the process had now crossed a threshold that it had not previously crossed. A member of the royal family had been taken into police custody and questioned about his official conduct as a government representative. Emily Maitlis, reached by CNN's Christiane Amanpour, expressed what she described as complete astonishment. She noted that the arrest came on Andrew's birthday and observed, dry-voiced, that this was not entirely without a certain bleak symmetry. She reiterated that she believed Andrew had lied to her in the 2019 interview about his contact with Epstein, and she pointed out that the emails that had subsequently surfaced confirmed this. She said she had rewatched the interview after the "We are in this together" email became public and had found herself noticing inconsistencies she had previously been uncertain about. The international press response was immediate and enormous. Correspondents in the United States, Australia, France, Germany, and Japan all led with the story. The arrest of a senior member of the British royal family in connection with the Jeffrey Epstein files was not only a British story. It was a story about power and accountability and the long reach of an operation that had touched institutions and individuals across multiple countries and decades. The misconduct in public office charge, if it proceeds to formal prosecution, will require the Crown Prosecution Service to establish several things. It will need to show that Andrew held a public office, which is not in dispute. His role as UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment was a formal, official appointment. It will need to show that he willfully misconducted himself in relation to the duties of that office, which in this case means showing that the forwarding of confidential government material to Jeffrey Epstein was a deliberate act rather than a negligent one, and that it was sufficiently serious to meet the legal threshold. It will need to show that the misconduct was without reasonable excuse or justification. These are not easy things to prove. The defense will argue that Andrew was keeping a friend informally informed about his activities, that he did not understand the material to be confidential in a way that precluded sharing, that there was no intent to advantage Epstein financially or operationally with the information. The prosecution will argue that a government representative of Andrew's seniority, who had received security briefings and was operating in a role that required confidentiality as a basic condition of trust, could not credibly claim ignorance of the nature of the material he was sharing with a convicted sex offender. Legal analysts who examined the charge in the days following the arrest were divided on the likely outcome. Several noted that misconduct in public office is a notoriously difficult charge to prosecute, with a high evidential bar and a history of acquittals in cases where intent is disputed. Others pointed out that the email evidence from the Epstein files, in which Andrew's forwarding of official documents to Epstein was visible in the email chains, gave investigators something they rarely have in misconduct cases: a contemporaneous documentary record of the alleged conduct. There was also the question of what other material the search of Andrew's homes had uncovered. The police did not disclose what had been taken from either the Sandringham property or Royal Lodge. The investigation was ongoing. Witnesses were being identified, including the personal protection officers who had accompanied Andrew on his official trips and his private visits, the diary managers who had coordinated his schedule, the household staff who had been present during the years of the friendship with Epstein. Everyone who knew anything about what Andrew had done during those years was now, potentially, a witness in a formal police investigation. There is a version of the Andrew story in which his life looks like a tragedy. A man born into an institution that he did not choose, raised by a mother who loved him in ways that made him less rather than more capable of navigating the world outside the palace, given a uniform and a role and a sense of purpose in the Falklands that the subsequent decades could never quite replace, and then left to drift through a life of diminishing significance in which Epstein and Maxwell offered him access to a world that felt exciting and connected and real in ways that ceremonial royal duties had stopped feeling years before. In this version, Andrew is a victim of his own formation, a man whose character was shaped by forces he did not control and whose judgment was never developed in any meaningful way. This version has some truth in it. It would be dishonest to deny that Andrew's upbringing was extraordinary in ways that stunted certain normal capacities for self-awareness and consequence reckoning. It would be dishonest to deny that the institution he was born into genuinely failed to equip him for a world that does not arrange itself around his feelings. But the version cannot survive contact with the girls. Whatever the forces that shaped Andrew's character, whatever the failings of his upbringing and the distortions of a life lived inside extreme privilege, those things do not reach into the account of a 17-year-old who was trafficked across an ocean, handed to a man in a townhouse, and paid $15,000 for it by the man who had organized the whole arrangement. They do not reach into the account of an orgy in a Manhattan mansion with girls who appeared to be under 18. They do not reach into the account of Sarah Kellen, sitting in a congressional hearing, describing dinner in Andrew's private apartments at Buckingham Palace and a birthday party for his daughter at Windsor Castle, attended by Jeffrey Epstein in 2006, 2 years before Epstein pleaded guilty to soliciting sex from a minor. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor has never stopped denying everything. He denied it in the 2019 interview. He denied it in the settlement papers, which included the specific language that he accepted Virginia Giuffre had suffered both as a victim of abuse and as a result of unfair public attacks, without admitting that he was responsible for any of that abuse. He denied it when he voluntarily gave up his titles in October of 2025, framing the decision as an act of service to the institution rather than an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He denied it after his arrest. There is a particular kind of denial that functions not as a statement of truth but as a strategy of position, a declaration made repeatedly to different audiences, in different contexts, in order to maintain a claim whose connection to verifiable reality has long since become secondary to the value of the claim itself. Andrew has been engaging in this kind of denial for more than 20 years. He has denied things that emails subsequently contradicted. He has denied things that photographs documented. He has denied things that the settlement agreement implicitly acknowledged. He has denied things while simultaneously paying millions of pounds to the woman he said he had no memory of meeting. The people who know him, the former palace staff and the naval officers and the royal correspondents who covered him for decades, have a word for this. They call it entitlement. Not in the casual sense in which the word is used to describe someone who expects too much from life, but in the specific, structural sense that describes a person who has been raised to believe that the rules exist for other people, that accountability is a thing that happens below a certain altitude, that his view of events is true simply because it is his view, and his word is sufficient simply because it is his word, and the women who say otherwise are liars or opportunists or fantasists. or simply beneath the level of consideration that his position requires him to extend. He is 66 years old and he has never changed, not visibly, not materially, not in any way that anyone who has observed him from close range has been able to detect. The monarchy that Andrew was born into is not the same institution it was in 1960. The monarchy that the Queen held together through force of character and a lifelong discipline that bordered on the inhuman is now in the hands of a king who is dealing with the consequences of decades of decisions his mother made, decisions his brother made, and decisions about how much you can protect the guilty before protecting them becomes a form of participation. King Charles has stripped Andrew of his titles. He has evicted him from his home. He has said the law must take its course. Whether the law takes that course to its conclusion, whether the evidence is sufficient to bring a formal charge and then a conviction, is a question that the courts will eventually answer. The women who were trafficked through Epstein's network have spent decades waiting for institutions to answer questions. Virginia Giuffre spent a decade being called a liar. She reached a financial settlement without a trial. She died before she could see the man she accused placed in a police vehicle on his birthday. Sarah Kellen testified before a congressional committee in Washington and described dinner in a palace. The woman whose lawyer described her tour of Buckingham Palace after a night at Royal Lodge has not been named publicly. There are almost certainly others. If this investigation means something to you, if you believe that these stories should be told, and that the people who have spent decades protecting themselves behind titles and palace walls should be held to account, then share this video, send it to someone who needs to understand the full picture, and subscribe to this channel, because this is not the last word on this story. There will be more. There is always more. We will be here when it comes. The question that hangs over the case of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor is not ultimately about the charge of misconduct in public office, as serious as that charge is. The misconduct charge is about emails and trade documents and what a government representative did with information that was not his to give away. It is a charge about professional conduct, about the abuse of official capacity for personal purposes. The deeper question is the one that Virginia Giuffre spent her life trying to get answered. The question of what happened to her in a townhouse in London in March of 2001 when she was 17 years old and had been trafficked across an ocean by a convicted sex trafficker, and what role Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor played in that night. That question has never been answered in a court of law. It may never be. The civil case settled without a trial. The criminal investigation that exists relates to a different set of allegations. The legal system, which moves along defined tracks and answers defined questions, may not arrive at the specific place where that specific answer lives. But the answer does not only exist inside a courtroom, it lives in the photograph, which multiple forensic experts have confirmed is genuine, which shows a man with his arm around a teenage girl who says he abused her, with the woman who trafficked her standing in the background. It lives in the email in which Andrew wrote to Epstein the morning after the photograph was published and said, "We are in this together and we'll play some more soon." It lives in the accounts of the people who were present, who described what they saw and experienced, who have been calling these things into the public record for more than 20 years at enormous personal cost. It lives in the pattern. A boy who grew up hearing no from no one. A teenager who shrugged off catching a schoolmate's stamps because the concept of consequence was genuinely foreign to him. A naval officer who told a superior he should be addressed as H because his title preceded his rank. A man who maintained a friendship with a convicted sex offender through that offender's imprisonment and release and registration as a sex offender, who brought the offender's associate to his daughter's 18th birthday party, who invited the offender into the most private spaces of his family's life, who forwarded government documents to the offender during official trade missions, who told a television audience he had ended the friendship in December of 2010 while simultaneously writing to the offender in February of 2011 to say, "Don't worry about me. We're in this together." A man who settled a lawsuit brought by the woman who said he abused her for a reported £12 million without admitting that any of what she described had happened, and who in the same settlement acknowledged that she had suffered as a victim of abuse. A man who, on the morning of his 66th birthday, was arrested and placed in an unmarked vehicle by officers from Thames Valley Police. The last royal to be arrested was in 1647. That is how long the institution has been managing to avoid this particular kind of reckoning. The question now is whether this time, after everything, the management finally runs out. Virginia Giuffre wrote, near the end of Nobody's Girl, that she had not wanted to live her life as a crusade. She had not wanted to spend the years she had being defined by what had been done to her when she was a girl. She had wanted to build a life, to be a mother, to be someone whose story was not primarily the story of what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and their associates had taken from her. She had wanted to be more than a victim. She had fought for that, across more than 2 decades, in courtrooms and congressional hearings and media appearances and the long, grinding work of advocacy for people who had been where she had been. She did not live to see Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor in handcuffs. She did, in a 600-page book published 6 months after her death, lay out in her own words precisely what she said had happened to her, who had been responsible for it, and what it had cost her. She named names, she described events, she provided the testimony she had been denied the opportunity to give under oath in a courtroom. The book was still on shelves when the arrest happened. It was still being discussed. Amy Wallace, her co-author, was still giving interviews about the process of writing it, about what Virginia had said and meant and wanted the world to know. The book existed, and the arrest existed, and they had arrived in the same narrow window of time, and whatever the legal process produces in the months and years ahead, these 2 facts had already accumulated a weight that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was going to carry for the rest of his life. He had spent 66 years believing that his position protected him, that the palace walls were thicker than they looked, that the title and the lineage and the history of an institution that had survived wars and revolutions and abdications and the relentless pressure of a century of media scrutiny would hold him inside their protection indefinitely. The walls had not held. They had cracked, and cracked further, and cracked again, and on a winter morning in Norfolk, 6 unmarked vehicles had driven through them and picked him up. The 6 unmarked vehicles did not care who his mother had been. They did not care what he had done in the Falklands. They did not care about the Pizza Express in Woking or the Central Park Walk or the interview at Buckingham Palace or the settlement agreement with its careful language and its undisclosed sum. They cared about the documents and the dates and the emails, and they had driven through the gates and arrived at his door on the morning of his birthday, and they had taken him away. That is where the story is, as of this telling. Whatever comes next, no one will be able to say they were not warned. No one will be able to say the signs were not there. No one who watched the interview, who read the emails, who followed the court filings, who heard the accounts of the women who were there, will be able to say with any credibility that this was a surprise. An accident waiting to happen, the people who knew him said, all the way back at the beginning. They said it about a spoiled child sliding downstairs on a silver tray. They said it about an entitled naval officer who announced himself as H. They said it about a playboy prince whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. They said it about a trade envoy who brought a convicted sex offender into his family's most private spaces. An accident waiting to happen. It took 66 years, but it happened. Jeffrey Epstein was not a random predator. He was a systematic one, and the system he built was one of the most sophisticated social engineering operations of the late 20th and early 21st century. Understanding how Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor fits into that system, how he was used and how he used it in return, requires understanding the operation itself. Epstein's method was not complicated. He identified young, vulnerable girls, usually in their early to mid-teens, usually without strong parental supervision, usually from circumstances that had already exposed them to some form of exploitation or need. He and Maxwell recruited them through a network of people who received payment for referrals. They built relationships with the girls through a combination of material generosity, flattery, and the gradual normalization of sexual contact under the guise of employment. They positioned themselves as benefactors, people who were elevating these girls, giving them access to a world they could never have reached on their own. The girls who went to work for Epstein were told they were masseuses. The massage was real, in the sense that it happened. The problem was the progression, the touch that began as professional, that shifted by degrees toward the sexual, that arrived at outright abuse in a context that had been so carefully constructed that the girls often did not have the framework to identify what was happening to them as abuse at all. They were 15, 16, 17 years old, in rooms with one of the wealthiest men in the world, who spoke about their futures as though he were invested in them, who paid for their travel and their clothes, and in some cases their education, who surrounded them with luxury that their actual circumstances gave them no reference point to contextualize. The recruitment of powerful men was the second half of the operation. Epstein collected them the way other people collect art, with the patience of a connoisseur and the eye of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He identified men who wanted access to something: money, connections, prestige, the company of beautiful young women, or some combination of all four. He provided whatever they wanted and kept records. Court documents and testimony from multiple survivors suggest that Epstein maintained what amounted to a blackmail infrastructure alongside his trafficking network. A collection of information about the men he entertained that could, if necessary, be deployed against them. Whether he ever explicitly deployed it is a question that the destruction of evidence and his death before trial have made impossible to fully answer. But the existence of the infrastructure explains something that many observers found puzzling: why so many powerful, intelligent men continued to associate with Epstein long after his conviction, long after the public record made clear what he was. The answer is that some of them were not making a free choice about the association. They were managing a relationship whose parameters Epstein controlled. The ones who had been most deeply drawn in, who had been most thoroughly documented in whatever records Epstein kept, were the ones who had the most to lose if those records surfaced. The relationship looked like a friendship. It was, for at least some of the men involved, something closer to a trap that had closed around them before they understood it was there. Where Andrew fits in this picture is a question that the ongoing investigation is presumably intended to answer, but certain things are visible without the investigation. Andrew received from Epstein what Epstein provided to the men he needed: access to interesting and influential people, social opportunities in New York and Palm Beach and the Caribbean that a working royal who was not heir to the throne might not have been able to generate for himself through official channels, and the company of young women who were present in large numbers at Epstein's properties. In return, Andrew gave Epstein something that Epstein could not buy and could not manufacture: proximity to the British royal family, access to royal residences, the social legitimacy that comes from being photographed at Balmoral and Windsor Castle and attended at royal events. Epstein and Maxwell appeared at Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party at Windsor Castle in 2006, a moment that would have registered in every room in which Epstein subsequently operated as proof of his relationship to the highest levels of the British establishment. Andrew was not just a friend, he was a credential. This arrangement was not secret. Andrew's relationship with Epstein was known within certain circles in London and New York throughout the years they were friends. The question of why it was not acted on, why the palace did not investigate, why Andrew's private office did not flag the relationship as a liability, why the Trade Ministry did not question whether the Special Representative for International Trade was appropriate company for a registered sex offender, is a question about the way institutions protect themselves and the people inside them. The answer, in most cases, is that the information existed in the places it needed to exist for someone to act on it, and that no one wanted to be the person who acted. Raising concerns about Andrew's relationship with Epstein meant raising concerns about Andrew. Raising concerns about Andrew meant raising concerns about the Queen's favourite son. Raising concerns about the Queen's favourite son meant raising concerns about the monarchy's ability to manage its own members, which was an institutional admission that the palace preferred not to make if any alternative was available. The alternative was always silence, a careful, managed, institutional silence that did not require anyone to tell an explicit lie, and did not require anyone to take an action they might later regret. The silence held for decades. It held through Epstein's first conviction and his work release and his Palm Beach visits by members of the royal family. It held through the walk in the park in New York, and the emails and the photograph and the BBC interview. The silence was a strategy, and the strategy had a logic, and the logic produced an outcome that the strategy had failed to foresee. Among the things the Epstein files revealed about the relationship between Andrew and Epstein that went beyond what had previously been publicly documented, two categories of information were particularly significant. The first was the trade documents, already discussed. The second was a series of communications that suggested Epstein's access to Andrew's world went substantially deeper than the palace had ever publicly acknowledged. The emails between Andrew's household staff member David Stern and Epstein form a picture that is difficult to reconcile with Andrew's stated account of when and how the friendship ended. In October of 2013, 3 years after Andrew claimed to have walked away from Epstein in Central Park, and nearly 2 years after the email in which Andrew told Epstein they were in this together, Epstein wrote to Stern, "I have a very beautiful friend coming to London on Tuesday. Andrew might want to have her for a dinner." The phrase, "a very beautiful friend," is the language Epstein and Maxwell used to describe young women they were managing. It is the language of the recruiting operation. It is not the language of a man making a casual social introduction. In October of 2013, Epstein was asking a member of Andrew's household staff whether his employer might want to have a young woman Epstein was sending to London for dinner. The record does not show what Stern replied or whether the dinner happened. What the record shows is that Epstein was treating a member of Andrew's household staff as a viable point of contact for organizing social arrangements involving young women in 2013, years after Andrew claimed the friendship was over. Either Stern was operating without Andrew's knowledge in a way that Andrew's current team would presumably have raised publicly if it were possible to credibly do so, or Stern was acting with Andrew's knowledge. And the whole walk in the park narrative was what Andrew's accusers had always said it was, a story, constructed after the fact, built to provide a cover for a relationship that had not ended when Andrew said it ended. The birthday message in 2014, which included a crude photograph of champagne being poured down a naked woman sent apparently by Stern alongside greetings from Andrew, suggested a continuing proximity between Andrew's world and Epstein's world that was both personal and strikingly casual. This was not a relationship being managed at arm's length by cautious palace intermediaries. This was a relationship in which Andrew's household staff and Epstein's operation were in regular, informal, often bawdy contact, sharing photographs and birthday greetings and requests for beautiful friends to come to London for dinner. The investigation of Andrew's conduct as trade envoy inevitably raised questions about the nature of the information he passed to Epstein and what Epstein's motivations for cultivating the relationship might have been beyond social and the personal. Epstein's financial operations have never been fully explained. His wealth, which various estimates placed between $1 and $2 billion, came primarily from a small number of ultra-high net worth clients who trusted him to manage assets of a type and scale that conventional wealth managers declined or were unable to handle. His fee structure was unusual, his client list was never fully disclosed, and the mechanisms through which he managed and grew the assets under his control were not examined in the kind of detail that would have required, because he died before trial. But several things about Epstein's financial operation are consistent with an interest in precisely the kind of information that a government trade envoy could provide. Epstein's clients were global investors who moved capital across international borders in ways that depended on knowing, ahead of the conventional market, where government attention and government money were being directed. A confidential brief from a trade envoy's visit to Singapore and Hong Kong and Vietnam, detailing potential investment opportunities that the British government was formally exploring, was not worthless information to someone managing that kind of portfolio. It was potentially quite valuable. Andrew's defenders have argued that he was naive rather than culpable, that he shared the documents without understanding their commercial value and without any intention of providing Epstein with a financial advantage. The defense of naivety has always faced an obvious problem, which is that Andrew served as UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment for a decade. He was extensively briefed on the commercial sensitivity of the information he generated in the role. He travelled with advisors who understood the protocols. He was not a man who stumbled into a government position without any preparation. He was a man who understood what the role was, who had been performing it for years, and who, according to the email record, chose to share documents from that role with a registered sex offender. The naivety defense also collides with the broader pattern. It is possible, in isolation, to construct a case for Andrew's naivety about any single element of the story. It is possible to argue that he didn't know what Epstein was doing, that he didn't understand what the document was, that he didn't know what Maxwell's role was, that he didn't realize Virginia Giuffre was a minor, that he had no way of knowing that the birthday party at Windsor Castle was attended by people who were actively managing a sex trafficking network. Each of these defenses taken individually contains some arguable ground. Taken together, they produce a picture of a man whose naivety extended in exactly the same direction in every instance, always toward the thing that protected him from accountability, never toward the thing that protected the people around him from harm. A man whose failures of perception were selective in a way that, over 66 years, became indistinguishable from something else. The relationship between Andrew and Sarah Ferguson throughout this period deserves examination because Ferguson's connection to Epstein is, in its own way, illuminating about the broader picture. Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, and Andrew continued to share Royal Lodge long after their divorce was finalized in 1996. This was publicly explained as a co-parenting arrangement, and it was partly that, but it was also a practical arrangement that suited both of them financially. Since Royal Lodge was a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate that they occupied essentially rent-free, under a lease arrangement that journalists later described as a peppercorn rent, with maintenance and security costs absorbed by the Crown estate. Fergie, as the press had always called her, had a complicated relationship with money. She had spent decades living at a scale she could not sustain independently, accumulating debts that she serviced through memoir deals and television appearances and commercial endorsements that sometimes generated headlines their own. In 2011, Epstein paid approximately $15,000 toward Ferguson's debts. The payment was discovered in the Epstein files and reported widely in the years that followed. Ferguson acknowledged it had happened, expressed regret, and said she was deeply ashamed of what had occurred. The files also showed that in July of 2009, 5 days after Epstein was released from prison following his guilty plea to soliciting sex from a minor, Epstein's team arranged flights for Sarah Ferguson, Princess Beatrice, and Princess Eugenie to travel to Miami to visit him. The cost of the flights, approximately $15,000, was to be covered by Epstein's operation. The family of the man who had just served time for crimes related to the sexual exploitation of minors flew to Palm Beach to see him within days of his release, and Epstein paid for their travel. Andrew has consistently characterized his ex-wife's relationship with Epstein as separate from his own, as something he was not responsible for and could not be held accountable for. But Andrew and Ferguson lived in the same house. They raised their daughters together in that house. They co-managed their finances to a degree that Buckingham Palace's own communications acknowledged when it became necessary to explain how Andrew had funded his lifestyle after leaving royal duties. The idea that Andrew was unaware of the trajectory of Ferguson's relationship with Epstein, or that the debt payment was not discussed between them, requires accepting a level of domestic disconnection that the available evidence does not really support. Ferguson's correspondence with Epstein, portions of which were revealed in the document's releases, was warm and personal. She addressed him as a steadfast, generous, and supreme friend. She apologized to him, in terms that went beyond conventional social correspondence, for something she described as having almost said. The tone of the letters suggested a relationship closer than that of a casual acquaintance who had done her a financial favor once. None of this makes Andrew responsible for his ex-wife's conduct, but it contributes to the picture of a household, a family, a world in which Jeffrey Epstein was not a peripheral figure whose presence was occasional and incidental. He was embedded. He was someone who paid for flights, who attended birthday parties, who settled debts, who arranged dinners, who corresponded with the household staff about beautiful friends coming to London. He was woven into the fabric of Andrew's life in ways that extended well beyond Andrew's own direct relationship with him. When the Queen died in September of 2022, She had already stripped Andrew of his military titles and patronages in the previous January, following the failure of his legal attempt to have Virginia Giuffre's lawsuit dismissed. She did not live to see the civil settlement, which came in February of 2022, 6 months before her death in September. She did not live to see the title removal, or the eviction from Royal Lodge, or the arrest. Those who were close to the late Queen in her final years described a woman who believed her son, who supported him, who was reluctant to take public action against him even as the evidence mounted, and who ultimately did what she had to do when the institutional damage became unavoidable. They described a woman who had protected her favorite child for decades in the way mothers do, with a loyalty that precedes reason, and who found herself in the last years of her life in the position of having to weigh that loyalty against something more fundamental. She chose the monarchy. She always chose the monarchy. It was the only thing she had been more devoted to than her children, and when the choice became unavoidable, she chose it again. Andrew's relationship with his father, Prince Philip, was different. Philip had given him the famous dressing down at Holyrood House in Edinburgh for being lazy and selfish. Philip had little patience for the self-indulgence that characterized Andrew's approach to his public duties in the years after the Navy. Philip was a man who had spent his entire adult life subordinating his personal preferences to institutional requirements, who had understood with a precision that approached the painful what it meant to be secondary, and who had done it with a discipline that no one who observed it could fail to respect. He looked at Andrew and saw someone who had been given everything and used it carelessly, who had been handed the credibility of the institution without understanding the obligation that came with it. Philip died in April of 2021, a month before the wave of Epstein file releases that would accelerate the crisis to its current point. Whether he knew the extent of Andrew's relationship with Epstein before he died, whether the palace told him what the files were expected to contain, is not publicly known. What is known is that he did not live to see the arrest, and that his absence in the room where King Charles is making decisions about his brother is felt. King Charles and Andrew have never been close. Charles is 8 years older. He is the heir who spent his childhood in the shadow of duties he found oppressive, and a media that found his sensitivity entertaining material. Andrew was the Queen's darling, the favoured one, the one who got the attention and the adoration and the passes. The relationship between them was not simple sibling rivalry. It was something more structural than that. Two people who occupied vastly different positions within the same institution, who needed different things from the same mother, who developed in opposite directions partly because the institution demanded it and partly because their characters had nothing in common from the start. Charles has been methodical and deliberate about the Andrew question. He stripped him of duties, titles, and home in stages that tracked the public pressure rather than outrunning it, which is either measured pragmatism or institutional cowardice depending on one's view. He waited until the Giuffre lawsuit was settled to remove the military titles. He waited until the memoir and the October 2025 document releases to remove the Prince title and the Royal Lodge lease. He waited until the arrest to release a statement of support for the investigation. At each stage he moved when he had to, not before. This is the logic of institutional survival rather than the logic of personal accountability, and the distinction matters because the two logics produce different outcomes. The logic of institutional survival says, manage the crisis in the way that protects the institution's long-term position. The logic of personal accountability says, the right thing to do when someone in your family has caused harm is to acknowledge the harm and support the process that addresses it, regardless of the cost to the institution. Charles has not yet arrived at personal accountability. Whether he does will depend partly on what the investigation produces and partly on whether the public and political pressure that has been building around the monarchy's handling of the Andrew question reaches a point that the logic of institutional survival cannot accommodate. There are observers who believe that point has already been passed. There are others who believe the institution can contain it. The monarchy has survived things that seemed unsurvivable before, and its capacity for absorbing scandal without structural change is genuinely formidable. But Andrew is 66 years old and lives on the Sandringham estate and goes to church on Easter Sunday and is photographed leaving the service in a car, and the cameras that follow him belong to media organizations that have been following this story for more than 20 years, and the story is not getting smaller. The women who have come forward about Jeffrey Epstein's network, taken as a group, represent one of the largest organized bodies of survivor testimony in the history of sex crime prosecution. Virginia Giuffre was the first to go public with specific allegations about named individuals. She was followed by others. Some gave depositions in sealed proceedings. Some testified in the Maxwell trial, which ended in December of 2021, with Maxwell convicted on 5 of 6 federal counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. Some have spoken to congressional committees. Some have given interviews, often with their names and faces protected. Some are still considering what they want to do. The Maxwell trial was the most comprehensive public examination of the trafficking operation that has yet been conducted in a legal setting. It established that the operation existed, that it was systematic, that it involved the trafficking of minors, and that Maxwell was a central participant who actively recruited and managed victims. It established the basic architecture, the recruitment at places like Mar-a-Lago, the grooming, the progression to sexual contact, the girls being made available to Epstein's associates. It established all of this beyond the legal standard of reasonable doubt. What it could not establish, given the way the charges were structured and the evidence presented, was the identities of all the men who received the girls that Maxwell and Epstein trafficked. The men were largely unnamed in the Maxwell trial. Some appeared in documents under pseudonyms. Some were referenced in testimony without being named. The trial was about Maxwell's conduct, and the prosecution chose to focus the evidence accordingly. The Epstein files, released in waves by U.S. courts and government bodies from 2023 through 2026, have progressively filled in the picture that the Maxwell trial left blank. They have named individuals. They have produced email chains and flight logs and scheduling documents and photographs that place specific people at specific locations at specific times. They have confirmed things that survivors had been saying for years and that had been disputed or dismissed by the people being described. Andrew's name appeared in the Epstein files in multiple contexts: the flight logs showing him on Epstein's private jet, the photographs at Epstein's Island and at Balmoral, the trade document emails, the household staff correspondence. Each release of documents added new material. The trajectory of the releases suggested that more material remained, that the process of disclosure was ongoing, and that the picture of Andrew's relationship with Epstein was likely to become more rather than less detailed as the investigation continued. The second woman whose attorney described her tour of Buckingham Palace after a night at Royal Lodge in 2010 had not, as of the date of Andrew's arrest, been publicly identified. Her attorney had made a brief statement to the BBC. The investigation was assessing the allegation. Whether her account will ever receive the formal legal process that Virginia Giuffre sought for more than a decade is a question the current investigation may eventually answer. What is notable about her alleged account is its specificity and its timing. 2010 was the same year that Andrew, according to his BBC interview account, walked away from Epstein in Central Park. If a woman was trafficked by Epstein to Andrew at Royal Lodge in 2010, the walk in the park narrative does not simply fail as a cover story for why he maintained contact after December. It fails as a description of what he was doing at the time he claimed he was ending the friendship. The Central Park meeting, if the new allegation is accurate, was not a farewell. It was, if anything, a renegotiation. The question of what the investigation into Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor will ultimately produce is genuinely uncertain. The legal process in England and Wales for a misconduct in public office charge is long, the evidential bar is high, and the Crown Prosecution Service is known for caution about high-profile prosecutions where the evidence is complex and the legal arguments are contested. The investigation may produce a charge, the charge may produce a trial, the trial may produce a conviction, or any of these stages may not happen, for reasons that are procedural rather than substantive, for reasons that say nothing about whether what Andrew is alleged to have done is true. What the investigation will not do, regardless of its outcome, is put the information back in the box. The emails exist, the photographs exist, the testimony exists, the settlement exists, the memoir exists, the congressional testimony exists. These things have been placed in the public record over a period of more than 20 years at considerable cost to the people who placed them there, and they are not going away. The British public's relationship to the monarchy has been shifting for decades in ways that the institution has managed, mostly successfully, through a combination of spectacle and reform and the sheer weight of habit. The big events, the coronations, the jubilees, the funerals, the weddings, still draw enormous crowds. The younger royals, particularly William and Catherine and their children, generate substantial goodwill. The monarchy's approval ratings, while not what they were in the Queen's era, remain positive. Andrew is the exception. His approval ratings, in polls conducted since the BBC interview, have consistently placed him among the most unpopular figures in British public life. He has no supporters to speak of in the public conversation. Even the people who would describe themselves as committed monarchists, who believe the institution is valuable and worth preserving, tend to make an exception for Andrew, to describe him as a problem that the monarchy should have addressed sooner and more decisively. He is not defended, he is endured. The question for the monarchy is whether endurance is enough, whether the institution can simply wait Andrew out, contain the damage, continue the reforms that have been underway for years, and emerge from the other side of the Epstein saga intact. There are monarchists who believe it can. There are Republicans who believe it cannot, that Andrew represents not an aberration but an expression, a distillation of what the institution produces when it operates without accountability, when it places rank above consequence and family above the law. The Republican argument is not a new one, but the Andrew case has given it new material. The idea that no one is above the law is a foundational claim of democratic societies. The idea that a member of the royal family might require an arrest in the 21st century, in a country with a functioning legal system and a free press and more than 20 years of public documentation about the matter in question, to be treated in accordance with that principle, is an argument that the institution's defenders find it increasingly difficult to answer. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor has spent his life believing, at some fundamental level, that the palace walls would hold. That they had held for everyone before him, and would hold for him too, that the institution's interest in protecting itself was identical to its interest in protecting him, that the machinery of denial and delay and managed communication that the palace had used successfully for decades would continue to function on his behalf. The palace walls are the same walls they have always been. They did not change. Andrew changed. Or rather, the world outside them changed, and Andrew did not change with it, which amounts to the same thing. The world now has email. It has flight logs that are legally subject to discovery in civil proceedings. It has congressional subpoena power that reaches across national borders. It has survivors who outlasted the stigma long enough to speak, who had daughters of their own and decided that the silence was not something they were willing to give the men who had wronged them. It has journalists who spent decades following the story when following it was unpopular and legally risky. It has prosecutors who, eventually, after the failures of the 2008 plea deal were fully exposed, decided that the failure needed to be addressed. The world also has a woman who spent the last years of her life writing a book that she knew might be published after she was dead, that she knew would place her account on the permanent record alongside the accounts of the men she described, that she wrote with the knowledge that she might not be alive to see what it produced. She was not alive to see it, but it produced something. The 6 unmarked vehicles drove through the gates at Sandringham on February 19th of 2026, and the man who had been Prince Andrew for 65 years and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor for 5 months was taken into custody for the first time in his life. He has still not admitted anything. He has still not apologized to anyone. He has still not looked Virginia Giuffre in the eye in a room where he is accountable for what he says. He cannot look Virginia Giuffre in the eye anymore. She is dead. She died at 41 in Australia in April of 2025 without having received the apology she said she was owed and the accountability she spent 20 years pursuing. What she left behind is the book and the testimony and the settlement and the photograph and the emails and the arrest and everything that the arrest may or may not eventually produce. She left behind a record that is more comprehensive and more legally substantiated than anything the palace's machinery has ever managed to generate on the other side of the ledger. She left behind a truth that required her to pay an extraordinary price simply to get it into the public domain. and that is now in the public domain permanently, in ways that cannot be managed or denied or waited out. Somewhere in that truth is an answer to the question of what happened in a London townhouse in March of 2001, when she was 17 years old and had been brought there from Florida by people who had been managing her since she was 15. Whether that answer ever receives its formal legal acknowledgement is the question the next phase of the Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor story is trying to answer. The people who have been asking it from the very beginning have waited a long time. They are still waiting. There is a document from 2025 that captures something about the palace's handling of the Andrew situation that most of the reporting on the subject tends to gloss over. The document was published by The Telegraph and concerns a member of Andrew's household staff who had been corresponding with Jeffrey Epstein for years. The household staff member, David Stern, had apparently been functioning not just as a palace employee but as a conduit between Andrew's domestic world and Epstein's operation. The emails suggest that Stern received requests from Epstein, communicated Andrew's responses, arranged social events, and maintained the social fabric of a relationship that Andrew had publicly claimed was over. Stern has not commented publicly on his role. Andrew has never been asked about Stern's conduct in a formal setting. The palace has never offered an explanation. But the existence of the Stern correspondence, running from at least 2010 through 2014 and possibly beyond, makes a particular question unavoidable. Did the palace know? The Buckingham Palace Communications Office, the private office of the Duke of York, the intelligence and security services that routinely monitor the associations of senior royals. At least some of these institutions were operating throughout the period during which Stern was corresponding with Epstein. The palace's security apparatus is not a passive one. Senior royals travel with protection officers, their communications are monitored for security purposes, their associations are assessed for risk. The idea that a member of Andrew's household was in regular contact with a registered sex offender under federal investigation, arranging social events and passing on birthday greetings, and discussing beautiful friends coming to London without anyone in the security apparatus being aware of it, strains credibility. The more likely explanation is that some people knew, or knew enough, and that the decision was made to manage the information rather than act on it. The management of inconvenient information about senior royals is not an unfamiliar institutional posture. The palace has a long history of deciding that certain things are better handled quietly than publicly, that certain associations are better described as private matters than as institutional risks, that the public interest in knowing is outweighed by the institutional interest in not having to explain. This approach has a name in institutional studies. It is called organizational silence, and it is one of the most studied phenomena in the literature on institutional failure. Organizations that practice organizational silence become progressively more vulnerable over time because the information they are not acting on does not go away. It accumulates. It becomes documented. And when it eventually surfaces, the damage is compounded by the evidence of the silence itself, by the demonstration that people within the institution knew and chose not to act, which makes the institution complicit in the harm that occurred on its watch. The palace is now dealing with the compounded damage. The harm caused to Virginia Giuffre and to other women in Epstein's network is one layer. The institutional complicity, the years of managed silence about an association that was visible, documented, and clearly incompatible with Andrew's royal duties, is another. The two layers together produce a crisis that is harder to manage than either would be alone, because addressing the harm requires acknowledging the complicity, and acknowledging the complicity requires the institution to answer for its own conduct in addition to Andrew's. King Charles's statement on the day of the arrest, "The law must take its course," is an attempt to navigate this. It places the king on the side of accountability without requiring him to specify what accountability looks like, or to explain why it took this long to arrive. It is careful language, as palace language always is. It says the right thing without actually saying anything about the palace's own role in the years during which accountability was not happening. In the weeks following the interview, an opinion poll found that 66% of British adults believed Andrew should be stripped of his remaining titles. A YouGov survey from the same period found that his favorability rating had dropped to -42, meaning he was 42 percentage points less popular than he was unpopular. He had achieved what few public figures manage, not just to be disliked, but to be disliked with such intensity and uniformity that his name had become a shorthand for a particular kind of catastrophic self-defeat. The interview had been intended to rehabilitate him. What it did instead was strip away the deniability. Before the interview, Andrew could point to the absence of a formal public examination of his account as a kind of protection. The things he was accused of had not been fully examined in a public forum, and the absence of examination could be presented as something like proof. After the interview, this protection was gone. He had offered his account publicly, under questioning, and the account had failed to hold. The Pizza Express, the sweating, the still not. These were now part of the permanent record in a way that no palace statement or legal letter could remove. The sociologist Irving Goffman wrote about what he called the presentation of self in everyday life, the way human beings manage the impressions they create in the minds of others through performance, through the careful management of information about themselves, through the staging of encounters in ways that privilege the aspects of their identity they want to be seen. Andrew's entire public existence had been an exercise in impression management. He had managed the impression that he was a war hero. He had managed the impression that he was a useful trade representative. He had managed the impression that his relationship with Epstein was a normal social friendship that any reasonable person might have maintained. He had managed the impression less successfully that he was a man of honor who had done the right thing by ending the friendship in person. The BBC interview was the moment when the staging collapsed, not because Maitlis was particularly aggressive, and not because Andrew made any single statement that was obviously and immediately devastating. The interview collapsed because Andrew was not performing. He was, for once, simply there, in a room, answering questions, without the architecture of managed impression protecting him. And what the audience saw, in the absence of the architecture, was a man who genuinely could not understand why his answers were not working. That is what stays with people who watched the interview. Not the specific content of any specific answer, but the look in his eyes as the interview progressed and the understanding began to dawn that it was not going the way he had expected. The confusion, the slight increase in the formality of his bearing as the formality became a wall behind which he was retreating. The moments when he reached for a phrase that he had clearly prepared and deployed it with the confidence of someone who had been told it was a good answer, and then watched it land badly and not entirely understood why. The Pizza Express answer was prepared. You can hear the preparation in the rhythm of it, the specific location, the specific purpose of the visit, the specific detail about why he remembered it. Someone, or possibly Andrew himself, had decided in advance that this was the rebuttal to the Tramp nightclub allegation, and the rebuttal had been worked up into a form that was intended to sound convincing. The problem was that a convincing alibi requires detail, and Andrew's detail ran out almost immediately. He had the restaurant and the child's birthday and the general location. He had nothing else. The sweating answer was also prepared. Andrew's team had clearly anticipated the question and had devised the adrenaline overdose medical condition as a response to it. The medical claim was specific enough to sound scientific while being vague enough to be impossible to immediately contradict. Andrew delivered it with the confidence of someone who believed it would settle the matter. It did not settle the matter. It became the most mocked moment in the interview, and it remained, for years afterward, one of the primary examples cited when media trainers and communications professionals explained what not to do when a reputation is under threat. The still not was not prepared. That one was Andrew. He had been asked whether he regretted the friendship with Epstein, whether, knowing everything he knew now, he wished he had made different choices. The answer he meant to give was, "I still do not regret it." The answer he gave was the compression of that, the accidental candor of someone whose internal monologue had slipped out before the performance could catch it. Still not. The phrase that told you, more clearly than any full sentence could have, that he had been asked this question before, internally, many times, that the regret had been presented to him as an option he could choose, and that he had declined it, repeatedly, and that the declining was so habitual it had become the default output of the system. He did not regret it because he did not believe he had done anything wrong. This is the hardest part of the Andrew story to hold in your mind simultaneously with everything else, because it requires accepting that a man can have done the things he is alleged to have done, can have maintained the associations he demonstrably maintained, can have told the stories that demonstrably contradict the documentary record, and genuinely not believe he has anything to account for. But it is the only explanation that is consistent with his conduct across 66 years. The entitlement is not performance. The entitlement is belief. He believed, as a child, that the rules did not apply to him because the adults around him demonstrated that they did not. He believed, as a teenager, that his classmates should extend to him the same deference the palace staff did, and when they did not, he was genuinely confused rather than chastened. He believed, as a naval officer, that his rank as a prince preceded his rank as an officer, and that this was the natural order of things. He believed, as a trade envoy, that his friendship with a wealthy financier was a private matter that had no bearing on his official conduct. He believed in the BBC interview that he could explain himself satisfactorily to Emily Mightless, and that the explanation would be accepted because his explanations had always been accepted. He believed, after the settlement, that paying the money was the end of the story. He believed, after relinquishing the Duke of York title, that the gesture would satisfy the demand. He believed, after losing the Prince title and Royal Lodge, that the eviction was the limit of what could happen to him. He was wrong, each time. He is still alive, which means he may have more occasions to be wrong about this. Each time he has been wrong, the wrongness has been more consequential than the time before, because the world has been watching and documenting and building a record that compounds with each new revelation. He does not learn, because learning requires accepting that you were wrong, and accepting that you were wrong requires believing that you could be. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, 66 years old, has never been convinced that he could be. This is not a psychological diagnosis. It is an observation about a pattern of behavior that is visible across a period of 6 decades and that has been described in almost identical terms by people from every context in which Andrew has operated. Childhood playmates, naval officers, palace staff, royal correspondents, legal analysts, media professionals, and the women who say he participated in their abuse. The consistency of the description across so many different sources and time periods is itself a kind of evidence. People who have nothing in common except their proximity to Andrew at different points in his life have arrived independently at almost the same assessment. It is the assessment of a person who has never been held accountable for anything significant and who has organized his understanding of himself around the assumption that he will not be. The assumption, on February 19th of 2026, was tested. Whether it holds will depend on what happens next in the legal process. But the test has been administered, and that, at minimum, is new. The specific question of whether Andrew will face a criminal trial on the misconduct in public office charge is one that legal analysts have approached with caution. The evidence available from the public record, the emails showing the forwarding of government documents, is documentary and specific. But misconduct in public office requires more than the act of forwarding a document. It requires establishing that the forwarding was a willful abuse of the official position, that Andrew knew or should have known that the material was not his to share, and that the sharing constituted misconduct serious enough to reach the criminal threshold. The defense will argue that Andrew shared documents with a friend in an informal social context, without any understanding that the documents were restricted, and without any intent to advantage the recipient. It will argue that the emails represent the kind of casual correspondence that any person, including a trade representative, might engage in with their social circle. It will argue that the specific documents in question did not contain information sensitive enough to constitute a breach of official duty in the criminal sense. The prosecution will argue that Andrew's position as special representative required a level of care about confidentiality that his actions demonstrate he did not exercise. It will argue that the identity of the recipient, a registered sex offender who was under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies and who had known commercial interests in the kinds of markets Andrew was visiting, makes the naivety defense not credible. It will argue that the pattern of continued contact with Epstein, documented in the same email chains that contain the document forwarding, demonstrates that Andrew was aware of the nature and sensitivity of the relationship. This is the case on both sides, as it stands from the available public record. What the searches of Andrew's homes and the interviews with witnesses will add to it is unknown. What is known is that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, who spent 60 years inside one of the most protected institutions in the world, is now inside a different kind of institution. He is inside a legal investigation which moves by different rules and responds to different pressures and does not make exceptions for titles or bloodlines or the wishes of a palace communications team. The institution he was born into protected him for a very long time. The institution he is now inside did not get the memo. To understand why the arrest felt significant beyond its legal implications, it helps to understand what Andrew's life has looked like since 2019. He did not disappear from view when he stepped back from public duties. He continued to live at Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion with its own chapel and staff and 8 acres of garden in the heart of Windsor Great Park. He continued to receive a grant from the sovereign's sovereign support, the public funds from which the royal family's expenses are paid, which means that British taxpayers have been funding, in whole or in part, the lifestyle of a man who has not performed any public function since the year the Epstein scandal destroyed his career. He played golf, he attended church services, photographed occasionally leaving St. George's Chapel or some other royal parish in a vehicle, looking neither left nor right. His face carrying the particular expression of someone who has decided that a composed blankness is preferable to any visible engagement with the world. He appeared at private family events when the family permitted it, which became progressively rarer as the years went on and the press coverage around him became a problem for the family's own communications. He was excluded from the Christmas celebrations at Sandringham in 2024. He was absent from public events that would previously have required his presence as a working royal. He spent those years in a kind of suspension, no longer a working prince, not yet publicly stripped of his title, living in the palace equivalent of a waiting room while the outside world processed what he represented and the inside world calculated when the price of keeping him would exceed the price of paying it. The calculation took longer than most observers expected. The patience of the institution, its willingness to absorb damage rather than take decisive action, extended well past the point at which decisiveness would have been less costly than patience. The royal biographer Andrew Lowney, whose book entitled Documented Andrew's Life in Detail, has described him as a narcissist who has consistently cast himself as a victim of the circumstances surrounding him rather than the author of them. Lowney pointed out that Andrew, in private conversations with people close to him, apparently expressed the view that he was being treated unfairly, that the criticism was disproportionate, that the media and the public and the legal system were pursuing him for reasons that had more to do with politics and institutional convenience than with genuine wrongdoing. He was the wronged party. He was the one who had suffered. This is a recognizable psychological position, and it is not one that emerges from a vacuum. It is the position of a person who has never encountered an authority they trusted and who has never been held to an account they found legitimate. Andrew does not appear to distrust the monarchy's authority over him in the way that, say, Prince Harry has explicitly articulated distrust of the institution. Andrew's relationship to the monarchy is simpler. He believes he is the monarchy, or at least a fundamental part of it, and that criticisms of his conduct are therefore, at some level, attacks on the institution itself rather than on him as an individual. This conflation of self with institution is common in people who have been raised inside powerful structures without ever being required to distinguish between what they personally deserve and what the structure confers. Andrew has never existed as a private individual. He has existed, from birth, as a public entity, a prince, a naval officer, a duke, a royal representative. The institutional identity has always preceded the personal one, has always been the frame through which others encountered him and through which he encountered himself. When the institution becomes the target of criticism, the person inside it experiences the criticism as personal. When the person inside it becomes the target of criticism, the institution experiences it as an attack. This explains, at least in part, why the palace's handling of the Andrew situation was so slow and so inadequate for so long. Andrew was not simply a member of the family who had made bad choices. He was embedded in the institution in a way that made separating him from it genuinely difficult, not because of legal technicalities, but because the institution had never developed the internal mechanisms for distinguishing between its identity and the behavior of its members. The Queen protected Andrew partly because she loved him and partly because attacking Andrew felt, at an institutional level, like attacking the monarchy itself. King Charles stripped Andrew of his titles partly because he concluded the cost of not doing so exceeded the cost of doing so, and partly because the relationship between the institution and the individual member had by then become clear enough that the separation was possible in a way it had not been while the Queen was alive. The night Virginia Giuffre described in Nobody's Girl was a night in March of 2001. She was 17. She had been trafficked from Florida to London. She had been given specific instructions in the back of a car about what was expected of her. She did not want to do what she was told to do. She did it anyway. After it was over, Epstein paid her $15,000. Giuffre wrote in the memoir that she had felt both cheapened and grateful, which is the precise psychological description of what trafficking does to its victims when they are caught inside it long enough. The gratitude is toward the money, which is real, and which represents a kind of transaction that makes the thing that happened to produce it seem, in the moment, more like work than like violation. The cheapening is what remains after the gratitude fades. What builds over years into the knowledge that someone decided she was worth $15,000 for an evening, and that the $15,000 was paid to her abuser, not to her. Epstein paid Giuffre. In another sense, Andrew paid Epstein. The money moved in a direction that told her exactly where, in the transaction's logic, she ranked. She wrote about the second encounter in Manhattan, at Epstein's East 71st Street mansion. With the careful distance of someone who had processed these events over decades of therapy and advocacy and legal proceedings, the orgy she described involved approximately 8 other girls who appeared to be under 18 who spoke little English, who were, in the language she used, there for the same reason she was. The girls did not appear to be American. They appeared to have been recruited, as she had been, from outside the country they were in. The third encounter was on Little Street James, the island, the place that Donald Trump, in 2015, had told reporters was a cesspool. The place where, according to multiple accounts from multiple witnesses over a period of more than 2 decades, girls were kept and used and rotated and managed as the operational output of an enterprise that had no legitimate name. Andrew was on the island. He was on the island at a time when the people who managed it knew what it was, and knew who was there, and knew why they were there. Whether he knew what it was is the question that every legal and moral examination of his conduct has to address. And the address, when you apply the standard of what a person in his position could reasonably have known, is not the same as the address when you apply the standard of what he told the BBC he knew. The island had a specific architecture. Epstein had a residence on it that contained, among other things, a distinctive blue and white striped building that came to be known in press coverage as the Temple. The building's function has never been officially established. Witnesses have described various things about it. It is visible in satellite photographs. Visitors to the island have described it as part of the landscape of a place that was, in its entirety, designed for a specific and undisguised purpose. Andrew visited the island. He visited it, on at least one occasion, documented in flight logs, in early 1999, before the friendship with Epstein had reached the depths it later achieved. He may have visited it on other occasions. The flight logs that cover the period most relevant to the allegations have been the subject of legal arguments about disclosure and authenticity that have not been fully resolved. The island, the mansion in Manhattan, the Palm Beach property, the Paris apartment. Epstein's properties were not separate spaces that could be visited without understanding what they collectively represented. They were the infrastructure of an operation, and the operation left evidence in every room it touched. Whether that evidence was visible to every visitor at every moment, or whether some visitors operated in a deliberate state of not looking, is a question about individual psychology and individual choices that the legal process may eventually require Andrew to answer in a specific and accountable context. There is a detail about the 2019 BBC interview that tends to get lost in the coverage of its most spectacular failures, and it concerns what Andrew said about why he regretted the interview after the fact. He said, in subsequent communications through his team, that he had been let down by the palace's communications office, that he had been given bad advice, that the decision to do the interview had been made in a context that did not adequately account for the risks. He was not responsible for the disaster. The people who advised him were responsible. He had simply done what he was told. This is instructive. A man who has spent decades believing that outcomes are the responsibility of the people around him rather than of himself, who has attributed every failure to bad advice and bad luck and bad journalism and bad faith on the part of his accusers, was confronted with the single most damaging public performance of his life and responded by identifying who else was to blame for it. He did not accept responsibility for the interview. He did not, in any communication that has reached the public record, say that he had made mistakes in that room, that his answers had been inadequate, that he had said things that were not true, or that he wished he had said differently. He said he had been let down. The pizza alibi had been his idea. The sweating medical condition had been his story. The still knot had been his feeling. But the interview had been the palace's fault, and the lesson he drew from it was that he needed better advisers, not that he needed to tell the truth. His ex-wife Sarah Ferguson appeared on multiple occasions in the years following the interview to express support for Andrew in terms that his communications team clearly welcomed. Ferguson told interviewers that Andrew was a good man, a caring father, a person who had been treated unfairly by a press and a public that were not willing to see the full picture. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived alongside him for decades and who maintained, whatever their formal relationship had become, a personal loyalty that the evidence around her had not managed to dislodge. Their relationship was already unusual before the Epstein story. Two people who had divorced in 1996 and continued to live in the same house for decades, who described themselves as best friends, who co-parented their daughters in an arrangement that outsiders found difficult to categorize, and that the palace press office found difficult to explain when questions arose about their financial arrangements. Epstein's payment of $15,000 toward Ferguson's debts in 2011 was one of those questions. The joint purchase of a Swiss chalet in 2014, shortly after the debt payment, was another. None of this amounts to a formal allegation against Sarah Ferguson. She has acknowledged the debt payment, expressed regret about it, and characterized it as a moment of financial desperation during which she exercised very poor judgment. She has not been charged with anything. She has not been the subject of any formal investigation that has been made public. But the picture of the household she shared with Andrew, of the financial entanglement with Epstein that ran through both of them, of the social integration of Epstein and Maxwell into the domestic life of the House of York, is not the picture of a man who had a discreet, limited friendship with someone who turned out to be a criminal. It is the picture of a life in which the criminal and his operation were woven into the fabric at multiple levels, over a period of more than a decade, and in which the people who occupied that life appear to have decided, each time the question came up, that the benefits of the relationship outweighed the risks of the association. That decision has consequences. The consequences are still unfolding. Jeffrey Epstein's list of clients and associates, to the extent it has been publicly reconstructed from the files, the flight logs, the emails, and the testimony of survivors, is a document about a very specific kind of power. Not political power in the elected sense, not military power, not even simply financial power, though Epstein had that in abundance. The kind of power that made Epstein's operation possible was social power, the capacity to be in the room where things were decided, to be the person other powerful people wanted to have dinner with, to accumulate and deploy credibility by association in a way that required no democratic mandate and no institutional accountability. The men who gathered around Epstein were gathered around something real. He could introduce them to each other. He could open doors that would otherwise be closed. He could provide access, in the broadest sense, that the conventional pathways of wealth and ambition and professional achievement could not reliably generate. He could bring in a room someone like Prince Andrew, a person whose title and family connections represented a form of social endorsement that no amount of money could directly purchase. And Prince Andrew, in return, received from being in that room a version of the excitement and relevance and access to the genuinely interesting world that his ceremonial royal life had stopped providing. The transaction was mutual. That is the thing that the discussion of the Epstein network tends to elide, because the language of victimhood and perpetration is designed for asymmetries of power, not for the complex web of mutual benefit and mutual exploitation that characterized Epstein's relationships with the men at the top of his social circle. Andrew was not Epstein's victim. He was Epstein's prize. He was the thing Epstein displayed to demonstrate that his access was real, that his connections were genuine, that the world he occupied was the world he said it was. The victims were the girls. They were always the girls. Everything else, the social engineering of the powerful men, the cultivation of the legitimizing relationships with politicians and scientists and royals, the careful management of the public image of a man who operated as a philanthropist and intellectual, even as he was systematically trafficking teenagers, was infrastructure. It was the machine that produced the conditions in which the abuse could happen and could be insulated from consequence. The girls were not incidental to the operation. They were the operation. Everything else was built to protect the operation, and the protection worked for a very long time. The protection worked because the men at the top of Epstein's social circle had incentives, in varying degrees, to keep the protection working. Some of them had participated in the abuse directly. Some of them had simply benefited from the social arrangement without participating in the abuse. But their presence at events and on flights and in social contexts that they knew or should have known were organized around a trafficking operation made them witnesses to something that they had declined to report. Some of them had allowed themselves to be cultivated by Epstein without examining too carefully what his cultivation of them was designed to achieve. All of them, for years, said nothing. When the protection finally failed, it failed not because of the men. It failed because of the women, the survivors who refused, at considerable personal cost, and in the face of sustained institutional resistance, to be quiet. Virginia Giuffre was the first to go public with specific allegations against named individuals. Others followed. Each time a survivor spoke publicly, the next one found it marginally less impossible to do the same. Each time the legal system was forced to take a formal step, whether an arrest, a lawsuit, a conviction, or a document release, the next step became marginally more available. The process was slow and grinding and required people to absorb damage that should not have been theirs to absorb, but it moved. The Maxwell conviction moved it. The Epstein files moved it. The Giuffre lawsuit moved it. The BBC interview moved it. The memoir moved it. Each movement was incremental and each was preceded by years of institutional resistance. The arrests of Andrew and Peter Mandelson in early 2026 are the points to which a very long accumulation of pressure has now led. Whether the pressure has led far enough is the question that cannot yet be answered. There is a version of the next chapter of this story in which Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor is formally charged with misconduct in public office, stands trial, and is convicted or acquitted according to the evidence as a court of law assesses it. This is the version that the rule of law requires, and that the survivors of Epstein's network, and the people who have spent years demanding accountability for the men around him, have been working toward. There is another version in which the investigation produces insufficient evidence for the Crown Prosecution Service to authorize a charge, or in which the charge is authorized but the trial ends in acquittal, and Andrew remains in the peculiar suspended state he has occupied since 2019, stripped of titles and home and military rank, living at the King's expense on a royal estate in Norfolk, neither publicly rehabilitated nor formally convicted, present in the news cycle every time a new document is released or a new witness speaks, but absent from any formal arena in which his account of himself is tested against external reality. The people who have followed this case for years are accustomed to this second version. It is, in many respects, the version that has prevailed for most of the story. Andrew has always been, in the formal legal sense, a man against whom no criminal conviction has been recorded. The civil case settled without a trial. The police review of Virginia Giuffre's allegations in the United Kingdom, announced years ago, concluded without action. The institutional protections that have surrounded him have been formidable, and the legal processes that could most directly address the allegations about his conduct with Virginia Giuffre are not the ones currently active. The misconduct in public office charge is real and serious, but it addresses what happened between Andrew and the British government's confidential information, not what happened between Andrew and Virginia Giuffre. The legal path to accountability for the latter has been complicated by the settlement, by Giuffre's death, by the absence of any criminal complaint in an English court that names Andrew and makes the specific allegation, and by the general difficulty of prosecuting historic sexual offences in any jurisdiction. The second woman, whose lawyer described a night at Royal Lodge followed by a tour of Buckingham Palace, is an adult who was allegedly trafficked to Andrew in 2010 when she was in her 20s. If she were to make a formal complaint, and if the investigation were to take her complaint seriously in the context of the broader inquiry, the picture would extend beyond the trade documents into territory that is more directly connected to Andrew's alleged conduct with women in Epstein's network. But she has not, as of the public record, made a formal complaint. Her attorney has spoken publicly. That is different. The history of the Epstein investigation is in many ways a history of the gap between what is known and what is formally actionable, the knowledge accumulated for years before the legal process could act on it. Survivors knew, investigators at various points knew, journalists knew, the communities in Palm Beach and Manhattan and the Virgin Islands where Epstein operated knew, or knew enough. The gap between knowing and acting is the gap that institutions exploit, that lawyers defend, that privilege maintains, and that eventually, if the pressure is sustained long enough, closes. Whether it has closed all the way in Andrew's case is the question that the next months and years will answer. The courthouse in Winchester that would handle an English misconduct in public office trial, should the charge ever reach that point, is roughly 75 miles from the house where Andrew grew up. It is a short drive from Sandringham, where he was arrested. It is approximately 60 miles from Royal Lodge, the home he occupied for 23 years and from which he was eventually expelled by his brother, the King. It is a distance he has never travelled in any formal sense. He has never appeared in court to answer for any of the things he is alleged to have done, the civil case settled before trial. The criminal processes have not yet produced a charge. He has been investigated, arrested, questioned, and released. He has not been tried. What it would look like, a trial, a formal legal proceeding in which Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor sat in a defendant's dock and was required to answer specific questions under oath, in public, with the full machinery of criminal procedure deployed to ensure that the answers received the scrutiny they deserved. This is something that the British legal system has not yet produced. It may produce it. It has not yet. There are people who would say that the arrest itself, the fact of it, is already a form of accountability, that the act of placing a member of the royal family in the back of an unmarked police vehicle on the morning of his birthday is itself a statement by the legal system that no one is exempt from examination. These people are not wrong. The arrest is significant. It is unprecedented in the modern era, in British history. It matters. But significance and precedent are not the same as accountability. Accountability requires an answer to a specific question. Did this person do this thing? And if they did, what is the consequence? The arrest opens the door to that question being asked in a formal and consequential setting. It does not yet answer it. The women who were trafficked through Epstein's network have been waiting for the answer for a long time. Virginia Giuffre waited 20 years and died waiting. The second woman whose lawyer has spoken publicly is waiting. The women who gave depositions in sealed proceedings and whose names have not been publicly disclosed are waiting. The survivors who testified in the Maxwell trial are waiting, in the sense that a conviction of a key figure in an operation does not, by itself, produce accountability for the other figures in that operation. They have waited through the interviews and the denials and the settlements and the document releases and the title strippings and the evictions and the arrest. They are still waiting for the specific, formal, legally binding answer that only a trial and a verdict can produce. Whether they get it will depend on things that are not yet visible from the outside. The evidence gathered in the searches of Andrew's homes, the testimony of the witnesses who are being identified and interviewed, the assessment by the Crown Prosecution Service of whether the evidence is sufficient to support a charge and a trial, and the judgment of a court if the case reaches one. What is visible from the outside, and has been visible for a long time, is everything that brought the case to where it is. The boy in the palace who tied the sentry's laces together, the teenager who shrugged off catching a school friend's stamps, the naval officer who announced himself as H. The playboy who was photographed on foreign beaches with women who were not his wife, the trade envoy who brought a convicted sex trafficker to his daughter's 18th birthday party at Windsor Castle. The man who wrote to that convicted sex trafficker the morning after a photograph of him with the trafficker's victim was published on British front pages and said, "We are in this together and we'll play some more soon." The man who told Emily Mightless he had no recollection of ever meeting the woman who said he had abused her at 17. The man who settled a lawsuit for a reported £12 million without ever admitting anything. The man who lost his title and his home and his military honours before losing his freedom on the morning of his 66th birthday to 6 unmarked police vehicles on a Norfolk estate. Prince Andrew is even more disturbing than you ever realised. That is the title of this investigation, and having sat with everything documented in it, having traced the arc from the palace nursery to the Norfolk estate, having read what Virginia Giuffre wrote before she died and what the emails show he wrote when he thought no one was looking, having examined the pattern across 66 years of a man who was given everything and believed it was his by right and acted accordingly, the title does not seem like an exaggeration. It seems like the most neutral thing you could say. When Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in December of 2021 on 5 of 6 federal charges, including sex trafficking of a minor, the verdict was received by survivors of Epstein's network with a mixture of relief and dissatisfaction. Relief, because after decades in which the operation had continued with near-total impunity, a key participant had finally been held accountable in a formal legal setting. Dissatisfaction because Maxwell, though central to the operation, was not its architect and was not its only enabler. The men who received the girls that Maxwell and Epstein trafficked were, with very few exceptions, not named in the trial and did not face charges. Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She is serving that sentence. Jeffrey Epstein died in 2019 without standing trial. The men who gathered around them, who flew on their planes and stayed at their properties and attended their events and received their introductions, have mostly continued their lives with the inconvenience of press coverage and the occasional congressional inquiry, but without the particular inconvenience of criminal prosecution. Andrew is the first of them in the formal sense to face arrest. Whether he is the last will depend on what the ongoing investigations in multiple jurisdictions produce, and on whether the political will to follow the evidence wherever it leads remains sufficient to sustain the process against the institutional pressures that have historically shortened it. The Maxwell trial established something that should not require a trial to establish, but that, in practice, has always required legal proceedings to make undeniable that the operation was real, that it was systematic, that it involved the trafficking of minors across state and national lines, and that it operated with a social infrastructure designed to protect itself from accountability through the cultivation of relationships with people powerful enough to make accountability difficult. The trial established this beyond a reasonable doubt in a federal court of law. The jury found it so, the judge sentenced accordingly. What the trial could not establish, because it was not designed to establish it, was the specific conduct of the specific powerful people who had been the operation's clients. The clients were referenced. They appeared in the testimony and in the documents. They were real. The trial simply was not their trial. The Epstein files, released progressively by U.S. courts and government bodies in the years following the Maxwell conviction, were supposed to fill this gap. They have, to varying degrees, done so. They have named individuals, produced contemporaneous documentary evidence, placed specific people at specific places at specific times in ways that go beyond the flight logs and the social calendar photographs that had been publicly known for years. They have produced material that has led to at least 2 arrests in the United Kingdom, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and Peter Mandelson. Whether they will lead to further arrests in the United Kingdom, in the United States, or in other countries is a question that the ongoing investigations will eventually answer or fail to answer in their own time. The specific women who have been publicly identified as accusers in proceedings connected to the Epstein network number in the dozens. The full number of women and girls who were trafficked through the network and who have not spoken publicly is unknown but is understood. by investigators who have examined the operation's records to be considerably larger. The operation ran for at least 2 decades. It operated across multiple countries and multiple properties. The girls were young, often transient, often from circumstances that reduced their social visibility. The operation was designed to be invisible to the people who would otherwise have been watching. Not all of them have spoken. Not all of them will speak. Some are dead. Some are living under the weight of what happened to them in silence, having made the calculation that speaking would cost more than they are able to pay. Some are in situations in which the people who traffic them are still, in some form, present in their lives or their communities in ways that make speaking unsafe. The ones who have spoken have paid a price. Virginia Giuffre paid it for 20 years and paid it finally with her life, at 41, in a country she had moved to, partly to put distance between herself and the people and places that represented the years inside the network. Sarah Kellen paid a different kind of price, one that is harder to characterize. She was a victim of Epstein's abuse who was also, according to federal investigators, a participant in the operation. And the complexity of that position, the way it has been received and processed and argued about publicly, is its own kind of cost. The other women whose names appear in documents and depositions and congressional transcripts have each paid something. In privacy and safety and the ongoing exposure that comes with having your worst experiences become public record. They have paid this price in the service of a truth that the institutions around Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the palace and the government and the legal establishment, spent decades declining to formally acknowledge. The truth is simple, even if the evidence required to establish it in a court of law is complex. A man who was born with every possible structural advantage used those advantages, over a period of more than 20 years, to avoid accountability for conduct that has caused documented, serious, ongoing harm to real people. He used the title, he used the palace walls, he used the settlement machinery. He used the gap between civil and criminal jurisdiction. He used his mother's protection for as long as she was alive. He used the institution's preference for managed silence over costly accountability. He used all of it, and it worked for a very long time. The 6 unmarked vehicles in the Sandringham driveway at 8 in the morning of February 19, 2026, represent the point at which, finally, at 66 years old and 7 years after the BBC interview, some part of the protection stopped working. What happens next will tell us how much of it remains. There is a detail in the Sarah Kellen testimony before the House Oversight Committee that has not received as much attention as it deserves. She testified that she organized meetings at Jeffrey Epstein's office in Palm Beach, Florida, while he was on work release from prison for Sarah Ferguson. Epstein's work release, granted as part of his sweetheart plea deal in 2008, allowed him to leave his West Palm Beach jail facility for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to work from his Palm Beach office. During this period, according to Kellen's testimony, she may have arranged meetings between Epstein and the Duchess of York. The detail that Epstein's work release office was the venue for meetings with the former wife of Prince Andrew is striking on its own. More striking is the context in which the meetings were taking place. Epstein had pleaded guilty to charges involving the solicitation of sex from a minor. He was, during his work release period, legally a registered sex offender. He was also, during this same period, being actively monitored by the conditions of his release agreement, which required him to remain at his office and not engage in any conduct that violated the terms of his plea. His actual conduct during the work release period, as documented by the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office in a report that was sealed for years and later released, was substantially different from what his plea terms required. The Sheriff's Office documented multiple violations. Epstein was leaving the office in unauthorized vehicles, staying at unauthorized locations, conducting meetings that his monitoring conditions did not permit. The report documented these violations and sent them to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The violations were not acted upon. The sweetheart deal held in all its sweetheart terms, despite the documented non-compliance. The Palm Beach Sheriff's Office report was one of the most damning documents to emerge from the Epstein file releases, not because it told a new story, but because it confirmed in official, contemporaneous police language what survivors had been saying for years, that Epstein operated with an impunity that was not accidental, that the protections around him were active rather than passive. and that the institution supposed to be monitoring his compliance with his sentencing conditions had chosen not to enforce them. Andrew's household was sending his ex-wife to meetings with this man during his work release period. Whatever the stated purpose of the meetings, whatever the agenda, the backdrop was a convicted sex offender who was violating his release conditions with the apparent acquiescence of the monitoring authorities. The family of the Queen's son was conducting business with him in those conditions. This is not a peripheral detail. It is another layer in the picture of how deeply embedded Epstein was in the world that Andrew occupied, and how completely the people in that world had insulated themselves from the implications of what the embedding meant. The question of how a person becomes capable of not seeing what is directly in front of them is, in Andrew's case, not a question about intelligence or perception. The people who know him, almost unanimously, describe a man who is not stupid. He is vain and entitled and self-deceived, but he is not dim. He can read a room. He can charm people when he needs to. He navigated decades of public life, managing press relationships and foreign dignitaries and trade negotiations and domestic crises in ways that required a functional social intelligence. What he cannot do, or what he had never been required to do, is see himself from the outside. The ability to step outside your own perspective and observe your behavior from the vantage point of someone who does not share your interests and your history and your assumptions is a capacity that requires practice. And practice requires feedback, and feedback requires someone willing to give it who is not afraid of the consequences of giving it. Andrew has spent 66 years in a world where the cost of giving him honest negative feedback has always been high and the benefit has always been uncertain. The world provided no practice. The capacity, therefore, did not develop. The BBC interview is the most visible exhibition of this, but it is the same quality that runs through every stage of the story. A man who could not see, when he sat down with Emily Mightless, that his Pizza Express story would not be accepted. A man who could not see, when he sent the "We Are in This Together" email, that it would one day be evidence. A man who could not see, when he settled the Jufre lawsuit, that paying £12 million without a trial would look, to the world, like something very close to an admission. A man who could not see, when he gave up his titles in October of 2025, that the gesture would not stop the investigation that led to his arrest in February of 2026. He has consistently failed to anticipate how his actions will appear from the outside, because the outside has never been a place he has had to inhabit. It is, in a way, the most expensive blind spot in recent British history. The cost of maintaining it has been borne by the women who were trafficked, who spent decades being disbelieved and harassed and legally outmaneuvered. It has been borne by the institution that protected him long past the point at which protection was sustainable. It has been borne by the public that funded his lifestyle while he maintained a posture of injured innocence. And it has been borne, finally, by Andrew himself, in the form of an arrest on a winter morning in Norfolk that the boy who slid down the palace staircases on a silver tray would never, at any point in his childhood, have thought possible. Nobody ever said no to him. He could do anything he wanted, and he did. Until, at last, they did.